The snow fell like ash over Ravencrest Cathedral as Duke Cedric Blackwood watched his father's coffin descend into frozen earth. 300 nobles stood in the cemetery wearing black silk and false grief, but not one of them looked him in the eye. They feared the old duke. They would learn to fear his son more. At 26, Cedric inherited an empire built on blood and a reputation for cruelty that preceded him like smoke before fire. The question wasn't whether he would rule with an iron fist. The question was whether anyone would survive to tell the story. Stay with me, because what happens next will shatter every assumption you have about power, obsession, and the thin line between control and destruction. Cedric didn't cry at the funeral because his father had beaten sentiment out of him before he turned 12. He stood beside the grave in a black greatcoat while wind cut through the cemetery like a blade, watching servants shovel dirt onto mahogany. The old duke had ruled the northern territories through calculated violence and political manipulation, building alliances through fear rather than friendship. He taught his son a single lesson repeated until it became scripture. Compassion is weakness wearing a mask. The crowd dispersed quickly. No one wanted to linger in the presence of the new duke longer than protocol demanded. Cedric turned away from the grave and found his cousin Marcus waiting near the stone archway, shoulders hunched against the cold. Marcus had lived in the castle since childhood, after his own parents died in a hunting accident that everyone suspected wasn't an accident at all. He understood the language of Blackwood brutality better than anyone. "The council wants to meet tomorrow," Marcus said quietly. "They're already circling." "Let them circle." Cedric's voice carried no emotion. "Vultures always do." They walked through the cathedral grounds toward the carriages. Snow crunched beneath their boots. Cedric could feel eyes tracking him from every direction, measuring him against his father's legacy, wondering if he would be stronger or weaker than the monster who built this empire. He intended to show them. Inside the lead carriage, Marcus pulled off his gloves and rubbed his hands together for warmth. "Your father had control because people believed he was untouchable. You need to establish that same authority immediately, or they'll test you." "I don't need authority." Cedric stared out the window at the passing landscape of bare trees and frozen fields. "I need fear." The carriage rolled through the gates of Blackwood Manor as twilight bled across the sky. The estate sprawled across 200 acres of northern countryside, a fortress disguised as a home with towers that pierced the clouds and walls thick enough to withstand siege warfare. Inside, servants moved through corridors like ghosts, speaking in whispers, always watching. Cedric went directly to his father's study, now his study, a vast room lined with books no one read and weapons no one touched. He poured himself whiskey and stood before the window overlooking the eastern fields where tenant farmers worked land they would never own. His father's voice echoed in his memory like a curse that wouldn't break. "Power isn't given, it's taken. And once you take it, you never let go." A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. "Enter it." The steward, an older man named Aldrich with silver hair and careful eyes, stepped inside. "Your Grace, there's a matter requiring your immediate attention." "What matter?" Aldrich hesitated, which meant the news was bad. "Lord Edmund Ashford has defaulted on his debt to the estate. The amount exceeds £40,000. Cedric set down his glass. "Cedric, how long has this been outstanding?" 6 months. Your father granted extensions twice, and Ashford took that as permission to ignore his obligations entirely. He claims the harvest failed and he needs another year to recover." Cedric turned from the window. "My father granted mercy twice, and Ashford interpreted that as weakness. That ends now. Send word that I'll visit the Ashford estate tomorrow at noon. Tell him to have the full amount ready, or I'll take payment another way." Aldrich's expression remained neutral, but something flickered in his eyes. Understanding, perhaps, or pity for what was coming. "Yes, Your Grace." After the steward left, Marcus appeared in the doorway. "You're going to make an example of him. I'm going to teach the entire territory what happens when someone mistakes patience for softness." "Ashford has 3 daughters." "I'm aware." Marcus stepped into the room and closed the door behind him. "Cedric, if you go too far on your first act as Duke, you'll turn potential allies into permanent enemies." "I don't want allies." Kedrick's voice was cold and final. I want obedience. The next morning arrived gray and bitter. Kedrick rode toward the Ashford estate with 10 soldiers behind him and Marcus at his side. The countryside passed in shades of white and brown, dead fields waiting for spring that felt impossibly distant. The Ashford manor appeared smaller than Kedrick remembered from childhood, a once grand estate now showing signs of decay. Paint peeled from the shutters. Gardens lay overgrown beneath snow. The fountain in the circular drive stood dry and cracked. Lord Edmund Ashford waited on the front steps, a man in his 50s with thinning hair and the desperate smile of someone who knew he was drowning. Behind him stood his wife and 3 daughters, all dressed in their finest clothes, trying to maintain dignity while bankruptcy stared them in the face. Kedrick dismounted and walked toward them with Marcus and 4 soldiers following close behind. Your Grace. Ashford bowed deeply, the gesture shaky. Welcome to our home. We're honored by your visit. I'm not here for honor. Kedrick stopped at the base of the steps. Where's my money? The smile faltered. Your Grace, as I explained in my letter, the harvest was catastrophic this year. Disease killed half the crops before autumn. I've already sold most of our valuables to cover other debts. I need more time. You've had 6 months. I need another year, 18 months at most. I swear on my family's name, you'll have every penny with interest. Kedrick looked past Ashford to the women standing behind him. Lady Ashford clutched her daughters close, all 3 girls pale and terrified. The youngest couldn't have been more than 16. The eldest was perhaps 20. Dark hair pulled back from a face that tried hard to show no fear and failed. Your family's name is worthless, Kedrick said. Your word is worthless. You borrowed against future prosperity that never came, and now you expect me to shoulder your failure. Please, Your Grace. Ashford's voice cracked. I'll sign over property. You can take the eastern fields, their fertile land worth at least 20,000. I already own the eastern fields. You lease them from me. Ashford's face went ashen. Behind him, one of the daughters made a small sound of distress. Kedrick let the silence stretch until it became unbearable. Then he spoke again, his voice carrying across the drive so everyone could hear. I'm going to give you a choice, Lord Ashford. You can repay the debt in full today, or you can offer me alternative compensation. What kind of compensation? Kedrick's eyes shifted to the 3 daughters. Your eldest. She'll come to Blackwood Manor as my ward until your debt is satisfied. The words landed like stones thrown into still water. Lady Ashford gasped. The 2 younger daughters grabbed each other, but the eldest, the one with dark hair and defiant eyes, went completely still. You can't be serious. Ashford's voice rose. Your Grace, she's my daughter, not property to be traded. Everything is property, Kedrick said, and you're in no position to negotiate. Either she comes with me now, or I seize this estate, sell it for whatever I can get, and turn your entire family out into the winter with nothing. Choose. Marcus moved closer, lowering his voice. Kedrick, this is madness. You can't just take someone's daughter. Watch me. Ashford looked back at his eldest daughter. She stared at her father with an expression Kedrick couldn't quite read. Not fear. Something harder. Something that looked almost like resignation mixed with anger. Father? She said quietly. It's fine. Elara, no. It's fine. Elara Ashford stepped forward, moving past her mother's grasping hands and her sister's protests. She walked down the steps until she stood directly in front of Kedrick, close enough that he could see the fury burning behind her carefully controlled expression. I'll go. Kedrick studied her. Up close, she was striking in a way that had nothing to do with conventional beauty. Sharp cheekbones, pale skin, eyes the color of storm clouds. She held herself with a rigidity that suggested she'd been preparing for this moment her entire life, even if she hadn't known it was coming. You understand what you're agreeing to? He asked. I understand you're a monster who preys on desperate people. Her voice was low, steady, laced with contempt. I understand my father made the mistake of trusting your family's word, and I understand that if I don't go with you now, everyone I love will suffer. So yes, Your Grace, I understand perfectly. Several soldiers shifted uncomfortably. Marcus looked away. Soldiers, Even Ashford seemed shocked by his daughter's directness. Caedric felt something stir in his chest. Not guilt. Definitely not sympathy. More like recognition. Here was someone who refused to collapse under pressure, who met cruelty with defiance instead of tears. Interesting. "Get your things," he said. "You have 10 minutes." Elara turned without another word and walked back into the house, leaving her family standing frozen on the steps. Her mother started after her, but Ashford caught her arm. "Let her go," he said hoarsely. "We don't have a choice." "There's always a choice," Lady Ashford whispered. "You chose this." The accusation hung in the cold air while they waited. Marcus pulled Caedric aside. "You know this makes you look like a tyrant, right? Taking someone's daughter over a debt? The entire territory will hear about this by tomorrow." Good. Caedric kept his eyes on the manor's front door. "Let them hear. Let them understand exactly what happens when they fail to honor their obligations to me. Your father ruled through fear, but he also understood politics. This isn't strategy. This is cruelty for its own sake." "My father is dead." Caedric's voice dropped to something dangerous. "I'm not interested in his methods anymore." Before Marcus could respond, Elara emerged from the house carrying a single traveling bag. She'd changed into a dark wool dress, better suited for travel, and she'd pulled her hair back into a severe braid. She looked older somehow, harder, like she'd shed some layer of innocence in those 10 minutes. She walked past her father without speaking. "Elara?" Ashford reached for her, but she stepped away from his touch. "Don't," she said. "You made your choice. Now I'm making mine." She moved toward the horses with her head high, refusing to look back even when her younger sisters called her name. Caedric gestured to one of the soldiers, who helped her mount a gray mare. She settled into the saddle with practiced ease, wrapping her cloak tighter against the wind. Caedric turned back to Ashford one final time. "You have 18 months to earn back 40,000 pounds. If you manage that impossible feat, your daughter returns home. If you don't, she stays at Blackwood Manor permanently. Consider it motivation." He mounted his own horse without waiting for a response. The ride back to the estate passed in tense silence. Elara kept her mare several lengths behind Caedric's stallion, refusing to ride beside him. Marcus tried to engage her in conversation twice, and both times she ignored him completely. They arrived at Blackwood Manor as afternoon light failed. The servants lined up in the main hall to meet the new arrival, their faces carefully blank. Caedric dismounted and handed his reins to a stable boy, then waited for Elara to dismount as well. She stood in the center of the courtyard looking up at the massive stone walls and narrow windows, and for the first time since leaving her father's estate, her composure cracked slightly, just a flicker of fear crossing her features before she locked it down again. "This way," Caedric said. He led her through the main entrance and into the grand hall, a cavernous space dominated by a massive stone fireplace and portraits of dead Blackwoods glaring down from the walls. His ancestors looked uniformly severe, men and women who'd built this empire through calculated violence and strategic marriages. Elara stared at the portraits with obvious disgust. "Your room is in the west wing," Caedric said. "You'll have a lady's maid assigned to you. You're free to move through most of the estate, but the North Tower and the dungeons are forbidden. Meals are served at 8 in the morning, 1 in the afternoon, and 7 in the evening. You're expected to attend." "Expected," Elara repeated, "not invited. You're a ward of this estate now. That comes with certain obligations." She turned to face him directly, and the fury in her eyes was incandescent. "I'm a prisoner. Let's not pretend this is anything else. If you were a prisoner, you'd be in chains." Caedric moved closer, closing the distance between them until he could see the rapid pulse at her throat. "Instead, you'll live in comfort, eat well, and want for nothing except your freedom. Many people would consider that a generous arrangement." "Many people are cowards." Elara's voice didn't waver. "I'm not grateful for a gilded cage just because you put silk sheets in it." Marcus cleared his throat from the doorway. "Perhaps we should let Miss Ashford rest. It's been a difficult day." "It's Lady Elara," she said without looking away from Caedric. "If you're going to steal someone's life, at least get their title right." Kedrick felt that strange stirring again, that flicker of something that might have been interest under different circumstances. She wasn't collapsing, wasn't begging, wasn't trying to manipulate him with tears or seduction. She was standing her ground despite having no ground left to stand on. "Mrs. Heather will show you to your room," he said finally. "We'll talk more tomorrow. I have nothing to say to you tomorrow. Then you can listen." Jeb. An older woman in a gray dress appeared from a side corridor, her face kind despite the severity of her clothing. "This way, my lady. I'll make sure you have everything you need." Elara followed the housekeeper toward the west wing staircase, and just before she disappeared around the corner, she looked back at Kedrick one more time. The expression on her face wasn't fear or hatred or even disgust. It was calculation, like she was already planning how to survive him. That night, Kedrick sat in his study with a bottle of bourbon and a growing sense of unease that had nothing to do with the debt he'd just collected in human form. Marcus appeared sometime after midnight, pouring himself a drink without asking permission. "You crossed a line today," Marcus said, "taking Ashford's daughter like some feudal warlord. This isn't the Middle Ages." "Isn't it?" Kedrick stared into his glass. "My father built this empire through force. I'm simply continuing his work." "Your father was brutal, but he was strategic about it. He never took someone's family member over a financial dispute. That's the kind of thing that starts rebellions." "Then I'll put down rebellions." Marcus set down his drink. "What's really happening here, Kedrick? Because this doesn't feel like strategy. This feels like you're trying to prove something. I'm proving that I'm not weak." "To who? The territory? Or yourself?" The question hit closer than Kedrick wanted to admit. He'd spent his entire life watching his father rule through calculated cruelty, learning that power meant never showing mercy, never hesitating, never allowing anyone to see the human beneath the armor. And now, with his father finally dead, Kedrick had to prove he was worthy of the empire he'd inherited. Taking Elara Ashford wasn't strategy. It was a statement. He finished his bourbon and stood. "Get some sleep, Marcus. Tomorrow I want a full accounting of every outstanding debt in the territory. If anyone else is struggling to pay, I want to know about it." "You're going to collect them all the same way?" "I'm going to make sure everyone understands the cost of breaking their word." Marcus left without another comment, and Kedrick remained alone in the study, listening to wind howl against the windows. Somewhere in the West Wing, Elara Ashford was probably awake too, staring at the ceiling of her gilded prison, planning her survival. He should have felt satisfied. Instead, he felt the first whisper of something that might have been doubt. 3 days passed. Elara attended meals in silence, ate without speaking, and spent her afternoons walking the grounds alone despite the bitter cold. Servants reported that she never complained, never cried, never asked for anything beyond basic necessities. She moved through Blackwood Manor like a ghost, present but fundamentally absent. Kedrick watched her from windows and doorways, observing the way she carried herself with rigid dignity, even when she thought no one was looking. She was performing obedience while radiating defiance, and it unsettled him in ways he didn't want to examine. On the 4th day, he found her in the library. The room occupied the entire 2nd floor of the South Tower, lined floor to ceiling with books his father had collected but never read. Elara sat in a window seat with a leather-bound volume open in her lap, sunlight cutting through the glass to illuminate her profile. She didn't look up when he entered. "You read," Kedrick said. "Observant." Her voice dripped sarcasm. "Is literacy surprising to you, or is this just how you make conversation?" "Some." He moved closer, scanning the shelves. "Most of the women I've known prefer embroidery to literature. Most of the women you've known are probably terrified of you. Are you not terrified?" Finally, she looked at him. "I'm furious. There's a difference." Kedrick pulled a book from the shelf at random, something about military history he'd never read. "Fury fades. Fear lasts." "Then you're going to be disappointed." Elara closed her book and stood, moving to return it to its shelf. "I won't become one of your cowering servants who flinch every time you walk past." I don't want you to cower." "What do you want?" "Hey." The question hung between them, and Kedrick realized he didn't have a good answer. He'd taken her as leverage, as punishment, as a demonstration of power. But standing here in the golden afternoon light with her storm-gray eyes challenging him to justify his own cruelty, he couldn't articulate what he actually wanted beyond the abstract concept of dominance. "I want your father to understand consequences," he said finally. "My father's not the one suffering those consequences." Elara's voice was sharp. "I am. He gets to stay in his crumbling manor feeling guilty while I'm trapped here playing whatever role you've decided I should fill in your twisted power fantasy. You're not trapped, you're collateral. Those are the same thing." She moved toward the door, but Kaedric stepped into her path. They stood close enough that he could smell lavender and something else, something that reminded him of thunderstorms. "You don't understand what it means to rule," he said quietly. "Every decision is a calculation. Every mercy becomes a weakness someone will exploit. Your father borrowed against prosperity he couldn't guarantee, and when that prosperity failed, he expected me to simply forgive the debt because it was inconvenient for him to honor his word. So you took his daughter." I took what he valued most to remind him that actions have consequences. But Elara's expression shifted, something dark and knowing sliding behind her eyes. "You didn't take me because my father valued me. You took me because you wanted to prove you're more ruthless than your dead father. I'm not leverage, Your Grace. I'm a trophy in whatever psychological war you're fighting with a ghost." The accuracy of the observation hit like a physical blow. Kaedric stepped back, unsettled by how easily she'd dissected his motivations. No one talked to him like this. No one challenged him with such direct brutality. Even Marcus, who'd known him since childhood, treated him with careful deference. But Elara Ashford spoke to him like he was a problem to be solved rather than a threat to be feared. "You think you understand me?" he said. "I understand men like you." Elara crossed her arms. "You've convinced yourself that cruelty equals strength, that mercy is weakness, that if you stop crushing people beneath your boot for even 1 second, everything you've built will collapse. You're so terrified of becoming vulnerable that you've made yourself into exactly the kind of monster no one can love." "I don't want to be loved." "Good, because you won't be." She brushed past him and left the library, leaving Kaedric alone among books. No one read, and portraits of dead tyrants who'd ruled through fear until fear finally consumed them. Sick. That night, something changed in Blackwood Manor. Kaedric couldn't name it, but he felt it like a shift in atmospheric pressure before a storm. Elara stopped performing obedience entirely. She questioned servants' orders when they didn't make sense. She rearranged furniture in the common spaces to suit her preferences. She played the piano in the music room despite never being given permission, filling the manor with haunting melodies that drifted through stone corridors like accusations. The servants, who'd been treating her like fragile glass, started treating her like actual nobility. And Marcus, who'd been trying to get Kaedric to send her home since the day she arrived, stopped mentioning it entirely. "She's making herself at home," Marcus observed over breakfast a week after Elara's arrival. "You realize that, right?" Kaedric watched Elara through the dining room doorway. She sat in the morning room reading correspondence she'd somehow convinced the steward to share with her, her dark hair loose over her shoulders and her expression intense with concentration. "She's adapting," Kaedric said. "She's conquering." Marcus buttered his toast. "Pochen. You brought her here as a prisoner, and she's systematically turning your own household against you through sheer force of personality. It's actually impressive." "No one's turning against me. Mrs. Heather asked me yesterday if Lady Elara would be staying permanently because, and I quote, the manor feels more alive with her in it." Kaedric's jaw tightened. "Mrs. Heather is sentimental. Mrs. Heather has worked for your family for 30 years and never once questioned your father's authority. But she's questioning yours because Elara makes her feel like this place is something other than a mausoleum." Before Kaedric could respond, Elara appeared in the dining room doorway carrying a stack of papers. "We need to talk," she said without preamble. "I'm eating, and I'm about to ruin your appetite." She dropped the papers onto the table in front of him. "These are requests from tenant farmers asking for debt relief or contract renegotiations. Aldrich has been sitting on them for months because he's too afraid to bring them to you. But someone needs to address this before you have a peasant revolt on your hands." Kaedric looked at the papers, then at Elara. "Since when do you have access to estate business?" since I convinced Aldrich that I'm not actually your enemy and might be helpful in preventing you from accidentally destroying your own territory through sheer stubbornness. Marcus made a sound that might have been a suppressed laugh. Kadrick's expression went dangerously cold. You're overstepping, Ichi Ishakiki. I'm helping you avoid a disaster. Elara pulled out a chair and sat down uninvited, leaning forward with her elbows on the table. These people aren't refusing to pay because they're lazy or dishonest. They're struggling because the harvest was terrible across the entire region. If you keep crushing everyone who falls behind, you'll have no one left to collect from. That's not your concern. It is if I'm going to be stuck here for 18 months watching you turn potential allies into permanent enemies through sheer pride. The silence that followed was electric. Marcus stood abruptly. I'm going to check on the horses. You two clearly need to fight this out alone. He left quickly, and Kadrick found himself alone with Elara across a breakfast table covered in evidence of his own tyranny. You don't know anything about managing an estate, he said finally. I know more than you think. Elara's voice softened slightly, losing some of its sharp edge. My father wasn't always incompetent. Before the bad harvests, before the debts, he ran our estate well. I watched him negotiate with farmers, mediate disputes, make strategic decisions about resource allocation. I learned everything he knew because I assumed I'd need to help manage eventually. And then he gambled away your family's fortune. And then he made desperate decisions from a position of weakness. She held Kadrick's gaze. The same position you're putting dozens of other families in right now by refusing any flexibility whatsoever. Kadrick picked up one of the requests, scanning the careful handwriting. A farmer named Thomas Warren asking for a 3-month extension on his rent because disease had killed his livestock, and he couldn't afford to repurchase animals and pay rent simultaneously. If I grant extensions, everyone will claim hardship, Kadrick said. Then investigate each case individually instead of assuming everyone's lying. Warren's legitimate. I checked his records. He's paid on time for 8 consecutive years before this. One extension won't destroy your authority. How did you access his records? I asked Aldrich nicely and told him I was trying to help. Elara smiled slightly, and it wasn't a kind expression. Turns out people are willing to bend rules when they think you're on their side. Kadrick set down the paper and studied her carefully. This woman who'd arrived as his prisoner was systematically infiltrating his household, winning over his servants, accessing his private records, and now sitting at his breakfast table challenging his governance strategy. She was either incredibly foolish or dangerously intelligent. Based on everything he'd observed, it was the latter. Why do you care, Ya? He asked. These aren't your people. This isn't your estate. You could spend 18 months in comfortable silence and go home when your father earns enough to buy back your freedom. Something flickered across Elara's face. Sadness, maybe. Or resignation. My father's never going to earn 40,000 pounds, she said quietly. We both know that. The estate's failing, the harvests are getting worse. Whatever happened between him and your father, it broke something fundamental in our finances. I'm not going home, Kadrick. This is my life now. The use of his given name was startling. So was the raw honesty in her voice. So I have a choice, Elara continued. I can spend however long I'm here being miserable and useless, or I can try to make this place less of a nightmare for everyone trapped inside it, including you. I'm not trapped. Yes, you are. She stood, gathering the papers back into a neat stack. You're trapped inside whatever cage your father built for you, and you're so busy proving you're strong enough to survive it that you can't see you're just making the cage smaller. She left the dining room with the papers under her arm, leaving Kadrick alone with cold toast and questions he didn't want to answer. Over the next 2 weeks, something shifted in the way Blackwood Manor operated. Kadrick granted the extension to Thomas Warren after personally verifying his story. 3 other farmers received similar consideration after investigation proved their claims legitimate. He didn't announce these decisions publicly, didn't make grand gestures about mercy, simply handled each case with pragmatic evaluation rather than blanket refusal. The territory noticed anyway. Whispers spread through the markets and taverns about the new duke being stern but fair, rigid but not unreasonable. The fear didn't disappear, but it tempered into something more stable, something sustainable. And through it all, Elara moved through Blackwood Manor like she'd always belonged there. She took breakfast in the morning room, worked with Aldrich on estate correspondence in the afternoon, played piano in the evening. She walked the grounds despite the cold, visited the stables to check on the horses, learned the names of every servant in the household. She was building a life inside her prison. Kedrick watched her constantly, though he tried to hide his observation. He found himself timing his movements through the manor to coincide with hers, manufacturing reasons to be in the same rooms, listening for the sound of her voice in adjacent corridors. Marcus noticed, of course. "You're obsessed with her," Marcus said one evening over cards in the study. "I'm observing her." Kedrick studied his hand. "She's a guest with unprecedented access to sensitive information. It's reasonable to monitor her activities." "You're in love with her." Kedrick's head snapped up. "I'm not in love with anyone." "Then what do you call standing at your window every evening, watching her walk through the gardens? What do you call changing your schedule so you're always in the library when she is? What do you call the fact that you haven't brutalized a single person since she told you to stop? Strategic adjustment. Obsession." Kedrick threw down his cards. "She's my prisoner. I don't develop feelings for prisoners." "She stopped being your prisoner the moment you started listening to her advice." Marcus leaned back in his chair. "Face it, cousin. You brought her here to prove you're powerful, and instead she's proving you're human, which might be the most terrifying thing that's ever happened to you." The accusation hung in the air like smoke. Kedrick wanted to argue, wanted to insist that his interest in Elara was purely tactical, that he was simply managing an asset, that his father's death hadn't fundamentally altered his entire worldview. But Marcus knew him too well, and the truth was becoming impossible to ignore. Dictat 6. Everything came to a head during the Winter Gala. The annual event brought together every noble family in the Northern Territories for 3 days of political theater disguised as celebration. Kedrick's father had used the gala to cement alliances, expose enemies, and remind everyone who held power. This year would be Kedrick's first gala as Duke, and every eye would be watching to see if he could maintain his father's iron grip. Elara was expected to attend. The morning of the first ball, Mrs. Heather delivered a black silk gown to Elara's room, along with explicit instructions on appropriate behavior. Elara listened politely, then immediately disregarded every guideline by choosing a deep emerald dress instead, styling her hair in loose waves rather than the severe updo expected of noble ladies, and wearing minimal jewelry. She looked stunning and completely defiant at the same time. When she descended the main staircase that evening, the entire ballroom fell silent. Kedrick stood near the fireplace, surrounded by territorial leaders and wealthy merchants, all of them trying to gauge his mood, read his intentions, predict his next move. But the moment Elara appeared at the top of the stairs, his attention locked onto her completely. She moved through the crowd with her chin raised and shoulders back, acknowledging greetings with polite nods but refusing to lower her eyes or apologize for her presence. Several noble women whispered behind fans. Older men frowned. Younger men stared with obvious interest. And Kedrick felt something dark and possessive coil in his chest. Marcus appeared at his elbow. "You're glaring at everyone who looks at her." "I'm observing." "You're about to start a fight with half the territory over a woman you claim means nothing to you." Before Kedrick could respond, Lord Edmund Ashford entered the ballroom with his wife and 2 younger daughters. The family looked diminished somehow, worn by months of financial struggle and the absence of their eldest. Lady Ashford spotted Elara immediately and moved toward her, but Ashford caught his wife's arm. "Don't," he said quietly. "It'll only make things worse." But Elara had already seen them. She crossed the ballroom floor with deliberate steps until she stood directly in front of her parents, and the entire room watched to see what would happen. "Father," Elara said. "Mother." Lady Ashford's eyes filled with tears. "Elara, darling, are you well? Has he hurt you?" "I'm fine." Elara's voice was steady. "Better than fine, actually. Blackwood Manor is considerably more comfortable than our crumbling estate." The words were carefully chosen, designed to wound. Ashford flinched. "Elara, please, we're trying to save enough to pay back the debt. Just give us time." "Take all the time you need," Elara said coldly. "I'm not waiting for you anymore." She turned and walked away, leaving her parents standing in the middle of the ballroom looking devastated and ashamed. Kaedric intercepted her near the champagne table, unable to stop himself despite knowing he should stay away. "That was cruel, Set," he said quietly. "I learned from the best." Elara took a glass from a passing servant. "Besides, they made their choice. I've made mine." "What choice is that?" She looked at him directly, and the intensity in her eyes was almost physical. "To stop waiting to be rescued and start building my own life here." Before Kaedric could process that, a voice interrupted from behind. "Your Grace, Kaedric turned to find Lord Vincent Blackmore approaching, a rival noble from the Southern Territories with political aspirations and dangerous connections. Blackmore had been subtly undermining Kaedric's authority since the funeral, spreading rumors about weakness and inexperience. "Lord Blackmore," Kaedric said neutrally, "I must say, your gala is quite interesting this year." Blackmore's smile was calculated. "I see you've acquired Lady Ashford as a ward. How progressive." "Lady Ashford is repaying her family's debt through service." "Service." Blackmore repeated the word like it was obscene. "Is that what we're calling it now? I'd heard you simply took her by force, like something out of a medieval romance." The insult was carefully crafted, designed to provoke a response while maintaining plausible deniability. Kaedric felt anger flash hot behind his ribs, but before he could respond, Elara stepped forward. "Lord Blackmore," she said smoothly, "I came to Blackwood Manor voluntarily to spare my family from homelessness. Perhaps in your territories, you allow nobility to starve rather than accept hard choices. But here in the north, we understand sacrifice." The ballroom had gone quiet again, everyone leaning in to hear. Blackmore's expression darkened. "Lady Ashford, I meant no disrespect. Of course you did." Lara's smile was razor sharp. "But you miscalculated. You thought attacking me would make the Duke look weak. Instead, you've just revealed that you believe a woman can't make decisions for herself without being coerced, which says considerably more about your character than his." Several people in the crowd made sounds of approval. Blackmore's face reddened. "Your Grace, if you can't control your ward, perhaps she shouldn't attend public functions." And that was the moment Kaedric made a decision he couldn't take back. He stepped beside Elara, close enough that it was clear they were presenting a united front, and when he spoke, his voice carried across the entire ballroom with absolute authority. "Lady Ashford speaks for herself because she's intelligent enough to do so. If you find that threatening, Lord Blackmore, perhaps you should examine why a woman's independence frightens you more than my army." The silence was total. Then Marcus started clapping slowly from across the room, and gradually others joined until the applause became genuine. Blackmore retreated with his dignity in tatters. And Kaedric realized he'd just publicly defended the woman he'd taken as collateral, fundamentally altering every assumption about their relationship. Elara looked at him with an expression he couldn't read. "Thank you." "Don't thank me." Kaedric's voice was low. "I'm not doing this for you." "Yes, you are." Before he could argue, she walked away, leaving him standing alone while the gala continued around him and something fundamental shifted inside his carefully constructed armor. Because Marcus was right, he wasn't just obsessed with Elara Ashford, he was falling catastrophically in love with her. And she had absolutely no idea how much danger that put her in. The gala continued around them like a living organism, nobles circling with champagne glasses and carefully constructed smiles, but Kaedric barely noticed. He stood near the marble columns, watching Elara move through the crowd with the confidence of someone who'd decided she had nothing left to lose. She spoke with merchants' wives and territorial officials, laughed at jokes he couldn't hear, commanded attention without demanding it. She'd transformed from prisoner to power in less than 3 weeks. And he'd allowed it. Marcus appeared beside him, holding 2 glasses of whiskey. He handed one to Kaedric without speaking, and they stood together watching the ballroom politics unfold. "You defended her," Marcus said finally, "in front of everyone. You know what that means. It means Blackmore's an idiot who needed to be put in his place. It means the entire territory now thinks Lady Ashford is under your personal protection, which makes her either your mistress or your weakness, possibly both." Kaedric drank, feeling the burn slide down his throat. "She's neither. Then what is she?" The question hung between them while across the room Elara accepted a dance from a young lord whose name Kaedric couldn't remember. The man's hand rested too familiarly on her waist. She smiled at something he said, and Kaedric felt that dark possessive thing coil tighter in his chest. "She's a problem I don't know how to solve," Kaedric said quietly. Marcus studied him for a long moment. "You're in deeper than you realize, and when people figure out how much she matters to you, they're going to use her against you. Let them try." The words came out harder than intended, carrying enough threat that Marcus stepped back slightly. "I'm serious, Kaedric. Your father ruled through fear because fear kept him safe. The moment people see you care about something, they'll target it. And Elara's not exactly subtle about challenging your authority. She's making herself into the perfect weapon for your enemies. Then I'll eliminate my enemies." "You can't eliminate everyone." Marcus set down his empty glass. "Eventually you have to choose. Power or the woman. You won't get to keep both." Before Kaedric could respond, the music changed tempo, and Elara's dance partner led her toward the edge of the floor. They stopped near the terrace doors, still talking, and the young lord leaned closer with obvious interest. Kaedric moved before conscious thought caught up. He crossed the ballroom in long strides, ignoring attempts to intercept him, focused entirely on Elara and the man standing too close to her. When he reached them, he didn't bother with pleasantries. "Lady Ashford," he said, "we need to discuss estate business." The young lord straightened immediately. "Your Grace, I apologize. I didn't mean to monopolize her attention. You're dismissed." The command was absolute. The man fled. Elara turned to face Kaedric with eyebrows raised. "That was unnecessary." "Was it?" He moved closer, close enough that she had to tilt her head back to maintain eye contact. The terrace doors stood open behind them, cold air spilling into the overheated ballroom. Several people were watching but trying to pretend they weren't. "You can't just interrupt my conversations whenever you feel like it," Elara said. "I'm not your property." "No, you're my ward, which means your behavior reflects on me." Her expression shifted, something dangerous sliding into place. "So this is about control. This is about appearances. You defended me publicly, which was strategic. But dancing with every ambitious nobleman in the territory sends a different message entirely." "What message is that?" "That you're available." The word landed between them like a stone. Elara's eyes narrowed. "Available? As in open to marriage proposals, political alliances? Or are you concerned someone might actually want me for more than leverage?" Kedric's jaw tightened. "I'm concerned you're being reckless. I'm being human." She stepped closer, dropping her voice so only he could hear. "You brought me here as collateral. You treat me like a pawn in whatever game you're playing with your dead father's ghost. But then you defend me in front of the entire territory and act jealous when someone else shows interest. You can't have it both ways, Kaedric. Either I'm your prisoner or I'm not. Choose." The challenge hung in the cold air between them. Around them, the gala continued, music and laughter and political theater. But in this small pocket of space near the terrace doors, something fundamental was shifting. Kaedric could feel it like tectonic plates moving beneath the surface. And he knew whatever he said next would determine the trajectory of everything that followed. "You're staying at Blackwood Manor until your father's debt is paid," he said carefully. "That hasn't changed. That's not an answer. It's the only answer you're getting tonight." He turned to walk away, but Elara caught his arm. Her grip was surprisingly strong. "You want to know what I think?" she said quietly. "I think you're terrified. Not of your enemies or losing power or failing to live up to your father's legacy. You're terrified that if you actually let yourself care about someone, it'll destroy everything you've built. So you keep everyone at a distance and convince yourself it's strength, when really it's just cowardice." The accusation cut deeper than any blade. Kaedric looked down at her hand on his arm, then back up at her face. The fury in her eyes had shifted into something more complex, something that looked almost like concern. "You don't know anything about what I'm afraid of," he said. "Don't I?" Elara released his arm. "You're standing here threatening anyone who gets close to me while simultaneously insisting I mean nothing to you. That's not strategy. That's panic." Before he could respond, Lord Blackmore's voice carried across the ballroom from near the entrance. "Your Grace, a word if you have a moment." Kaedric turned to find Blackmore standing with 3 other southern nobles, all of them wearing expressions of calculated concern. This wasn't a social request. This was an ambush. "Excuse me," Kaedric said to Elara, and moved toward the group before she could argue. The 4 men led him toward a private salon off the main ballroom, and the moment the door closed behind them, the pretense of civility evaporated. We need to discuss your management of the territory, Blackmore said without preamble. There are concerns about your decision-making. Concerns from whom? Several families. Merchants. People who've served your family for generations, but worry you're becoming too lenient with debt enforcement. Kadrick leaned against the desk, arms crossed. You mean they're worried I'm not brutal enough? We're worried you're allowing personal attachments to compromise your judgment. Blackmore gestured toward the ballroom. Lady Ashford seems to have considerable influence over your policies. She's not even nobility, yet she's advising on estate management and attending formal functions as though she belongs here. She does belong here. I brought her here as collateral for a debt, not as a political advisor. The other three nobles nodded in agreement, a coordinated attack clearly planned in advance. Kadrick felt anger building behind his ribs, cold and focused. Lady Ashford has provided valuable insight into territory management. She understands the perspective of families struggling with debt because she comes from one. That perspective is useful. It's also dangerous, another noble interjected. People are saying you've gone soft, that you're granting extensions and reducing penalties because a pretty woman asked you to. Your father would never have allowed such weakness. My father is dead. The words came out harsh enough that all four men stepped back slightly. And his methods died with him, Kadrick continued. I'm building something different here, more stable, more sustainable. You're building vulnerability. Blackmore's voice hardened. The moment your enemies realize you care about that woman, they'll use her against you. And when they do, you'll have to choose between maintaining your power and saving her life. Your father understood that love is a liability a ruler can't afford. Then perhaps my father was wrong. The admission shocked even Kadrick. He'd spent his entire life internalizing his father's teachings, building armor from lessons about cruelty and control. But standing in this salon listening to men criticize him for showing the first genuine human emotion he'd felt in years, something inside him rebelled. These men didn't fear weakness. They feared change. Blackmore seemed to sense he'd pushed too far. Your Grace, we're simply concerned for your well-being and the stability of the territory. My well-being isn't your concern. And the territory is more stable now than it's been in years. People are paying their debts because they believe the system is fair, not because they're terrified. That's sustainable power. It's also slow power. And while you're building trust, your enemies are building armies. The threat was barely veiled. Kadrick straightened, moving away from the desk. If you have intelligence about threats to the territory, bring it to me through proper channels. If you're manufacturing conspiracies to justify your own political ambitions, understand that I will destroy you without hesitation. Those are your options. Choose carefully. He left the salon before they could respond, pushing back into the ballroom where the gala continued in full swing. He scanned the crowd for Elara and found her standing near the windows talking with Marcus. When she saw him, something in her expression shifted. She crossed to him immediately. What happened? Politics. Her eyes narrowed. Try again. Kadrick glanced around at the watching crowd. Not here. He led her through the terrace doors into the cold night air. The garden stretched dark and frozen beneath winter stars, and for a moment they stood in silence while music drifted from inside. Blackmore and his allies are concerned about my leadership, Kadrick said finally. They think you're making me weak. Am I? He turned to face her. You're making me question everything I thought I knew about power. Whether that's weakness or growth, I honestly can't tell anymore. Elara wrapped her arms around herself against the cold. Your father trained you to believe caring about people is dangerous. But maybe the real danger is becoming so isolated that no one's willing to follow you without a sword at their back. My father built an empire. Your father built a prison and called it legacy. She looked at him directly. You don't have to keep living in it. The words hit something deep inside him, some locked compartment he'd been protecting since childhood. He thought about his father's endless lessons in cruelty, the way every display of emotion was punished, the gradual hardening that transformed a boy into a weapon. What if I don't know how to be anything else? He asked quietly. Then learn. Simple words. Impossible implications. Kadrick stepped closer, close enough to see his breath mingle with hers in the cold air. I'm not good at this. At caring about people. At being vulnerable. I know. If I do this, if I let myself actually feel something for you, it puts a target on your back. Every enemy I have will try to use you against me. I know that too. And you're still standing here. Where else would I go? The question was almost playful, but underneath it lay real vulnerability. Elara had nowhere else to go. Her father's estate was failing. Her family couldn't protect her. She'd built a life inside Blackwood Manor because it was the only life available. But somewhere along the way, she'd stopped seeing it as a prison. And so had he. Kaedric reached up slowly, giving her time to pull away, and brushed a strand of dark hair from her face. She didn't flinch, didn't step back, just watched him with those storm-gray eyes that had challenged him from the first moment they met. "This is a terrible idea," he said. "Probably. It's going to make everything more complicated. Definitely." But he kissed her anyway. The moment his lips touched hers, something inside him cracked open. Years of carefully constructed armor, decades of learned cruelty, generations of Blackwood brutality, all of it fractured under the weight of genuine human connection. Elara kissed him back with the same fierce intensity she brought to everything else, her hands fisting in his coat, pulling him closer despite the cold and the risk and the watching eyes that were definitely tracking their every move from inside the ballroom. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Kaedric rested his forehead against hers. "You're going to destroy me," he whispered. "Good," she said. "You needed destroying anyway." Huss. News of the kiss spread through the territory before dawn. By the time Kaedric came down for breakfast the next morning, Marcus was waiting with a stack of messages from various nobles demanding clarification on the Duke's relationship with Lady Ashford. Some were congratulatory, most were concerned, a few were openly hostile. "You've created a political crisis," Marcus said, dropping the messages on the table. "Half the territory thinks you're being manipulated by a fortune hunter. The other half thinks you've lost your mind and fallen for your own prisoner. What do you think?" Marcus poured himself coffee. "I think you're finally acting like a human being instead of a sentient weapon. But I also think you've just painted a target on Elara's back so large that every enemy you have is currently planning how to exploit it. Let them plan." "Kaedric, this is serious." Blackmore left the gala early last night with his allies. "They're organizing something. They're always organizing something." Before Marcus could argue further, Elara entered the dining room wearing a simple gray dress and carrying a book. She looked calm, unbothered by the political storm she'd helped create. "Good morning," she said cheerfully. "I see we're famous." Marcus stared at her. "You're not concerned? Should I be?" She sat down and reached for the coffee. "Kaedric's been threatening people since I arrived. This just gives them a clearer target." "That's what concerns me," Marcus said. "You're the target now." "I've been the target since the day I walked into this manor." She looked at Kaedric. "At least now we're being honest about what's actually happening here." "And what is happening here?" Marcus asked. Elara smiled slightly. "Evolution." Over the next week, the territory watched Kaedric and Elara with obsessive attention. Every interaction was dissected for meaning. Every conversation was analyzed for weakness. The Duke who'd taken a woman as collateral was now openly involved with her, and no one knew quite how to process the shift. Kaedric found himself in uncharted territory. He'd spent years learning how to rule through fear, but no one had taught him how to rule while caring about someone. Every decision now carried additional weight. Every threat to his authority was also a potential threat to Elara. She handled it better than he did. While Kaedric struggled with the political implications, Elara simply continued living. She worked with Aldrich on estate management, played piano in the evenings, walked the grounds despite the cold. She refused to hide or apologize or perform submission for an audience that wanted her broken. And somehow, her refusal to bend made her even more powerful. One afternoon, Kaedric found her in the library again, this time with a stack of financial records spread across the table. She was making notes in a leather journal, her expression focused. "What are you doing?" he asked. "Trying to figure out why the Northern Territory's revenues have declined 17% over the last 5 years. She didn't look up. "Your father was a brilliant tactician but a terrible economist. He squeezed people so hard they stopped producing anything worth squeezing." Kaedric moved closer, looking at her calculations. "These are confidential records. Aldrich gave them to me." She finally looked up. "He's worried the estate is heading toward insolvency within 3 years if current trends continue. Someone needed to analyze the actual numbers instead of just threatening people into compliance. And you appointed yourself financial advisor?" "Someone had to." She pushed the journal toward him. "Look at this. Every time your father increased penalty rates for late payments, revenue dropped the following quarter. Because people who couldn't pay the original amount definitely couldn't pay double. So they stopped trying entirely and fled to other territories. You've inherited an empire built on extraction rather than production. It's not sustainable. Kedrick studied her notes. The analysis was thorough, the conclusions uncomfortably accurate. What's your solution? Incentivize production instead of punishing failure. Lower interest rates on agricultural loans. Create markets for surplus goods instead of taxing everything at source. Give people reasons to stay and thrive rather than flee and hide. She leaned back. Revolutionary concepts, I know. You're talking about rebuilding the entire economic model of the territory. I'm talking about saving it. She held his gaze. Your father's methods were effective for maintaining power, but terrible for creating wealth. You can either continue his approach and watch everything collapse within a decade, or you can try something different. And if different doesn't work, then at least you'll fail trying to build something rather than succeeding at perpetuating misery. The blunt assessment was vintage Elara. Kedrick sat down across from her. You realize this makes you more than my ward. If I implement changes based on your analysis, you become an actual political advisor. That gives you real power. I already have real power. She smiled slightly. I'm the woman who convinced the most feared man in the North to stop being quite so terrifying. That's worth more than any title. Before Kedrick could respond, urgent footsteps echoed in the corridor outside. Marcus burst through the door without knocking, his face pale. We have a problem. Major problem. What kind of problem? Marcus glanced at Elara, then back to Kedrick. Lord Ashford's estate burned down last night. Complete loss. And Ashford himself is missing. The words took a moment to process. Elara stood slowly, her journal forgotten. What do you mean missing? There was a fire around midnight. By the time it was contained, the entire main house was destroyed. Lady Ashford and your sisters escaped, but your father wasn't with them. No one's seen him since yesterday evening. Oh, God. Elara's face went white. Where's my mother? My sisters? They're being housed by neighbors. Marcus hesitated. They're asking for you. Kedrick stood immediately. Prepare a carriage. We're leaving in 10 minutes. Your Grace, this could be a trap, Marcus warned. If someone's targeting the Ashfords to get to you through Lady Elara, riding straight into it is exactly what they want. I don't care. Kedrick moved toward the door. Elara's family needs her. We're going. They made the ride to the remains of the Ashford estate in tense silence. Elara sat rigid across from Kedrick, staring out the window with an expression he'd never seen before. Fear. Real, visceral fear that something terrible had happened to her father, despite their complicated relationship. When they arrived, the devastation was total. The main house was a blackened skeleton, still smoking in places. Servants and neighbors moved through the rubble, salvaging what little remained. And standing near the ruins, wrapped in a borrowed cloak, was Lady Ashford with Elara's 2 younger sisters. The moment Elara stepped from the carriage, her mother ran to her. They collided in an embrace that spoke to months of separation and worry, and Kedrick watched them from a distance, feeling like an intruder on private grief. Where's father? Elara asked urgently. What happened? Lady Ashford pulled back, tears streaming down her face. He was in his study when the fire started. We thought he got out, but when we reached the meeting point, he wasn't there. We searched for hours. Elara, I don't think he made it. The words hung in the cold air. Elara's expression went blank, shock overriding everything else. He can't be dead. We haven't even spoken in weeks. Our last conversation was me telling him I wasn't waiting for him anymore. That can't be the last thing I said. Kedrick stepped forward, unsure what to do, but unable to watch her break without trying to help. We'll organize search parties. If he's alive, we'll find him. But even as he said it, they all knew the truth. No one survived a fire that destroyed an entire manor. Lord Edmund Ashford was dead, and his final legacy was debt, ruin, and a daughter who would never get the chance to reconcile. Lady Ashford looked at Kedrick with something between gratitude and accusation. Thank you for bringing Elara. I know you didn't have to. She's part of my household now. Of course I brought her. The older woman studied him carefully. You care about her. It wasn't a question. Yes, Kedrick admitted. I do. Then protect her. Lady Ashford's voice dropped to a whisper. This fire wasn't an accident. Someone set it deliberately. And if they were trying to kill Edmund, they might target Elara next. The implication settled like ice in Kedrick's stomach. Do you know who? I have suspicions, but I need to verify before I make accusations. Lady Ashford gripped Elara's hand. Promise me she stays with you at Blackwood Manor. Promise me you'll keep her safe. I promise. Over the next 3 days, they searched for Lord Ashford's body and found nothing. Either he'd burned so completely there was nothing left to recover, or he'd fled before the fire and was hiding somewhere. Neither possibility offered much comfort. Elara moved through those days in a state of controlled shock, helping her mother and sisters sort through the wreckage of their lives while simultaneously processing her own complicated grief. She'd been angry at her father, furious at his weakness and bad decisions, but she'd never wanted him dead. On the 4th day, they buried an empty coffin. The funeral was small, poorly attended, a reflection of how far the Ashford family had fallen. Cedric stood beside Elara throughout the service, and when she finally broke, when the weight of everything became too much and tears spilled down her face, he pulled her against his chest and let her grieve without judgment. Later, as they prepared to return to Blackwood Manor, Lady Ashford pulled Cedric aside. I found something in the ruins, she said quietly, pressing a folded paper into his hand. It was in Edmund's study, protected in a metal box. I think you need to see it. Cedric waited until they were in the carriage heading home before reading the document. It was a letter addressed to Lord Ashford, dated 2 weeks before the fire. The handwriting was familiar. It was from Lord Blackmore. The letter outlined a proposal. Ashford would provide testimony about Cedric's cruel collection of his daughter as debt payment, supporting Blackmore's petition to have Cedric removed as Duke on grounds of tyranny. In exchange, Blackmore would forgive Ashford's gambling debts to him, which apparently exceeded £20,000. Ashford had written a response at the bottom of the letter in shaky handwriting. I cannot betray the Duke. He has my daughter. Refused. Cedric read the letter 3 times, fury building with each pass. Blackmore hadn't just been plotting political opposition. He'd been blackmailing Ashford. And when Ashford refused to cooperate, Blackmore had burned down his estate. This was assassination dressed as accident. He looked up to find Elara watching him. What is it? He handed her the letter without speaking. She read in silence, her expression hardening with each line. He killed my father. We don't have proof. He burned down our estate because my father wouldn't testify against you. She looked at Cedric with something fierce and terrible in her eyes. Blackmore killed him to send a message, or to eliminate a witness who could expose his conspiracy. Either way, he's responsible. Her voice was cold, empty of everything except rage. What are we going to do about it? Cedric should have said something about proper legal channels, about investigation and evidence and justice through appropriate systems. But looking at Elara's face, at the barely controlled fury of someone who'd lost everything and was finally staring at the person responsible, he found himself saying something else entirely. We're going to destroy him. The words were a promise and a declaration of war. And the moment he spoke them, Cedric understood he'd finally crossed the line his father had always warned him about. He was no longer making decisions based on strategic advantage or political calculation. He was making them based on love. And there was no coming back from that. The war room at Blackwood Manor smelled like old leather and colder decisions. Cedric spread maps across the oak table while Marcus stood by the window, and Elara paced the perimeter like something caged and furious. Outside, winter pressed against the glass with the kind of cold that made bones ache. We need evidence, Marcus said for the 3rd time. You can't just accuse a territorial lord of murder without proof. We have the letter. Cedric's voice was flat, emotionless. Blackmore tried to blackmail Ashford into testifying against me. When Ashford refused, his estate burned. The timeline speaks for itself. Timeline isn't proof. Marcus turned from the window. You need witnesses, physical evidence, something that ties Blackmore directly to the arson. Then we find it. Elara stopped pacing. Someone set that fire. Someone who works for Blackmore or takes his money. People like that always leave traces. Cedric studied her across the table. She'd been different since the funeral. Harder. The grief had burned through her, leaving something cold and focused behind. He recognized it because he'd worn the same armor his entire life. The difference was he'd chosen it. She'd had it forced on her. I have contacts in the Southern Territories, Cedric said. People who owe me favors. I'll send inquiries about anyone connected to Blackmore who might have been near the Ashford estate the night of the fire. That'll take weeks. Elara's hands pressed flat against the table. By then, Blackmore will know we're investigating. He'll cover his tracks. He's already covering his tracks, Marcus interjected. The smart move is building an airtight case before making accusations. Otherwise, you look like you're manufacturing conspiracies to justify personal revenge. Maybe I am. Elara's eyes were cold. Would that be so wrong? The question hung in the air like smoke. Yes, Keodric said quietly, because revenge without proof makes you look unstable. And if I look unstable, every noble family in the north will join Blackmore's coalition. We'd be fighting the entire territory. So we wait. Elara's voice carried disgust. We sit here doing nothing while my father's killer walks free because politics demands we be careful. We don't do nothing. Keodric moved around the table toward her. We investigate quietly, build evidence, and when we have enough to hang him legally, we destroy him so completely there's no chance of resurrection. She looked at him for a long moment, and something in her expression shifted. Not agreement, more like resignation to the cruel mathematics of power. Fine, she said. We do it your way. For now. The way she said for now carried a warning neither man missed. Over the next 2 weeks, Keodric's network spread through the southern territories like roots seeking water. Quiet inquiries, discreet investigations, money exchanged for information about Blackmore's movements, his associates, anyone who might have been involved in the Ashford fire. What they found was worse than expected. Blackmore hadn't just targeted the Ashfords. He'd been systematically building a coalition of nobles who feared Keodric's changing policies. The grants of debt relief, the reduced penalties, the elevation of Elara to informal advisor, all of it was being spun as weakness, as evidence that the new duke had lost his father's ruthless edge, and people were listening. Marcus delivered the intelligence reports one evening while Keodric sat in his study reviewing financial records. He dropped a folder on the desk without ceremony. Read that and tell me we're not in serious trouble. Keodric opened the folder and scanned the first page, then the second. By the third, his jaw was tight enough to ache. Blackmore had 12 families committed to his coalition, 12 noble houses representing nearly 40% of the territory's military strength. They were calling themselves the Council for Traditional Governance, which was code for "We want the old brutal duke back." And their primary grievance was Elara. Not just her influence on policy, but her very existence as evidence that Keodric was compromised. They were arguing that a duke who could be manipulated by a common-born woman was a duke who couldn't be trusted to maintain order. The analysis was surgical and devastating. This is bad, Keodric said. It's worse than bad. Marcus poured himself whiskey without asking. They're planning to petition the crown for your removal, and they have enough support that the petition might actually be heard. On what grounds? Incompetence, moral weakness, failure to maintain territorial stability. Marcus drank. They're building a case that you're not fit to rule because you let personal feelings compromise your judgment. Where's Elara now? Library, I think. Why? Because I need to tell her she's become the justification for a coup. He found her exactly where Marcus said, curled in the window seat with a book she wasn't reading. She looked up when he entered, and something in his expression made her set the book aside immediately. What happened? He handed her the intelligence report without preamble. She read in silence, her face going progressively paler. They're blaming me, she said finally. They're using you. There's a difference. Not to them. She looked up at him. To them, I'm exactly what Blackmore wants me to be. Proof that you're weak. You're not proof of anything except that I'm capable of caring about someone, which in their world is the same as weakness. She stood, moving to the window. Maybe they're right. Don't. No, listen. She turned to face him. Everything they're saying, it's true. You've changed since I arrived. You're less brutal, more willing to negotiate, more concerned with fairness than fear. Those are all things that make you a better ruler, but also make you more vulnerable to people who want you destroyed. So what are you suggesting? That I go back to being my father? I'm suggesting that as long as I'm here, I give your enemies exactly what they need to undermine you. Elara's voice was steady despite the pain in her eyes. Maybe the smart move is sending me away, back to my mother. Somewhere I can't be used as leverage. No. The word came out harder than intended, carrying weight that surprised them both. I'm not sending you away because it's politically convenient, Keodric continued. That's exactly what Blackmore wants. He's trying to isolate me by making you into a liability. If I capitulate to that pressure, I prove him right. So we're trapped. She crossed her arms. If you keep me here, they use me against you. If you send me away, you admit I was the problem. We're not trapped. Kadrick moved closer. We're fighting a war on multiple fronts, and the only way to win is by refusing to play by their rules. What does that mean? It means instead of hiding you or apologizing for caring about you, I make you official. Give you a real position in the territorial government. Prove that you're not a weakness, but an asset. Elara stared at him. You want to make me what, exactly? Your advisor? Your mistress? Your wife? The last word hung between them like something fragile and dangerous. Kadrick hadn't thought that far ahead, hadn't allowed himself to imagine a future where Elara was permanently integrated into his life rather than temporarily held as collateral. But standing here in the library with winter light cutting through dust motes and conspiracy closing in from all sides, he realized marriage wasn't just a political solution. It was what he actually wanted. Any of those, he said carefully. All of those. Whatever you'll accept. She studied him for a long moment. You're serious? Completely. This isn't about love. This is about strategy. It's about both. The admission cost something. Kadrick had spent years learning to separate emotion from decision-making, to treat human connections as transactions rather than relationships. But Elara had systematically dismantled those defenses without even trying. And now he was standing in his father's library offering marriage as both tactical maneuver and genuine proposal. I need time to think, Elara said finally. We don't have time. Then I need it anyway. She left the library before he could argue, and Kadrick stood alone among books and dust, wondering when exactly he'd lost control of everything. 3 days later, Marcus burst into Kadrick's study without knocking. His face was white. We have a problem, immediate crisis-level problem. What kind of crisis? Marcus closed the door and lowered his voice. I just received word from a contact in Blackmore's household. They're planning to move against you during the spring council in 2 weeks. Some kind of coordinated attack using the petition for removal as cover. Attack how? I don't know specifics. But my source said it's not just political. Marcus hesitated. They mentioned blood. The word landed cold. Assassination, Kadrick said flatly. That's my read. They're going to try to kill you and make it look like territorial justice. Claim you were becoming a tyrant and they had no choice but to act. Who's involved? Blackmore, obviously. But my source thinks others in your inner circle might be compromised. They couldn't give names. The implication was ice water down his spine. Someone inside Blackwood Manor was feeding information to the conspiracy. Someone close enough to know his movements, his plans, his vulnerabilities. Someone he trusted. Kadrick's mind raced through possibilities. Staff he'd known since childhood. Advisors who'd served his father. Territorial officials who'd sworn loyalty. Marcus was watching him carefully. You're thinking what I'm thinking, that we can't trust anyone. Exactly. Before either could continue, a knock interrupted them. Aldrich's voice came through the door. Apologetic but urgent. Your Grace, Lady Elara requests your presence in the East Wing immediately. She says it's urgent. Something in the steward's tone raised alarms. Kadrick and Marcus exchanged glances, then moved quickly through the corridors toward the East Wing. They found Elara in one of the guest rooms, standing over an open trunk with papers scattered across the bed. Her face was ashen. What is it? Kadrick asked. She pointed to the papers without speaking. He moved closer and felt the floor drop out from under him. They were letters, dozens of them. Correspondence between someone in Blackwood Manor and Lord Blackmore detailing Kadrick's movements, his decisions, his relationship with Elara. Detailed intelligence about territory management, financial records, private conversations. Everything an enemy would need to destroy him. And the handwriting was familiar. It was Marcus's. Kadrick turned slowly to find his cousin standing in the doorway. Marcus's expression had shifted from concern to something colder. Something resigned. I'm sorry, Marcus said quietly. I really am. The betrayal hit like physical violence. Kadrick couldn't breathe, couldn't think past the roaring in his ears that sounded like every assumption he'd ever made cracking open. How long, he managed, since your father died? Marcus stepped into the room but didn't come closer. Blackmore approached me at the funeral, made certain promises about autonomy and power if I helped facilitate your removal. You've been feeding him intelligence for months. Yes. Why? Marcus's expression twisted into something bitter. Because you were changing, becoming softer. Letting that woman, He gestured toward Elara. Turn you into something your father would have despised. I watched you grant debt relief and reduce penalties, and listen to advice from someone with no right to give it. You were destroying everything the Blackwoods built, so you sold me out. I tried to save the territory from your weakness. Marcus's voice rose. Your father understood that mercy kills empires, that love is a liability. You forgot those lessons the moment she arrived. Elara moved slightly, positioning herself between Cedric and Marcus. You killed my father. Marcus looked at her with something approaching pity. I didn't kill him. Blackmore's people did. But yes, I provided the intelligence that made it possible. Ashford was a weak link who might have warned you about the conspiracy. He had to be eliminated. The casual admission was worse than the act itself. Cedric felt something inside him go cold and focused. All the rage and betrayal and shock compressed into a single point of absolute clarity. His hand moved toward the knife at his belt, old reflexes from years of training taking over. But Elara caught his wrist. Don't, she said quietly. Not like this. He deserves it. Probably. But killing him now makes you exactly what they're claiming you are. A tyrant who murders people without trial. The logic cut through his fury just enough to make him hesitate. Marcus watched the exchange with interest. You've trained him well. Made him question his own instincts. This is exactly why you're dangerous. I'm dangerous? Elara's laugh was bitter. You betrayed your own family, helped murder my father, and fed intelligence to conspirators planning assassination. But I'm the threat? You're the infection. Marcus's tone was matter-of-fact. Cedric was becoming a proper duke before you arrived. Brutal, but effective. Then you convinced him that compassion was strength. Now, look at him. Hesitating before killing a traitor because you taught him to value mercy over justice. Mercy is justice. Mercy is suicide. The philosophical argument hung between them while Cedric's mind raced through options. Marcus's betrayal changed everything. If his own cousin had been compromised, how many others were feeding information to Blackmore? How deep did the conspiracy reach? And more importantly, who could he trust now? The answer was devastating in its simplicity. No one except Elara. We're locking him in the dungeons until I figure out what to do, Cedric said finally. Then we're reviewing every single person with access to sensitive information. Cedric, you don't have time. Marcus's voice was urgent despite being caught. The Spring Council is in 2 weeks. Blackmore's moving against you whether I'm imprisoned or not. He has enough support to petition for removal and enough soldiers to enforce it violently if necessary. Then I'll prepare for war. Against half the territory? You'll lose. Your father's allies are dead or retired. The new generation doesn't fear you like they feared him. They see you as weak. Because you've been telling them I'm weak. Because you are. Marcus straightened despite his predicament. Your father would have killed me the moment he discovered my betrayal. No hesitation, no mercy. But you're standing here having a philosophical debate about justice because that woman convinced you cruelty is wrong. That's why you're going to lose. The words were designed to wound, and they succeeded, because part of Cedric wondered if Marcus was right. If the changes Elara had inspired were making him into a better man but a worse ruler. If caring about her had compromised his ability to make the hard decisions that kept empires intact. If love really was the liability his father always claimed. Elara seemed to read his thoughts. Don't, she said quietly. Don't let him make you doubt yourself. But the doubt was already there. Cedric called for guards and had Marcus taken to the dungeons. Then he stood in the guest room surrounded by evidence of betrayal and felt the full weight of his isolation. Everyone he'd trusted was potentially compromised. Every decision he'd made since his father's death was now suspect. And the woman he'd fallen catastrophically in love with was the excuse his enemies needed to destroy him. The mathematics of power had never been crueler. What are we going to do? Elara asked. Cedric looked at her, really looked at her, and saw the same exhaustion and fear he felt. She'd lost her father, her home, her entire family structure. And now she was trapped in a fortress surrounded by conspirators, while the man who claimed to love her spiraled into paranoid calculation. I don't know, he admitted. And the honesty cost everything. Over the next week, Cedric systematically reviewed every member of his household and territorial government. Interrogations. Background investigations. Loyalty tests. He was looking for other traitors, other sources of intelligence leaking to Blackmore's coalition. What he found was worse than more betrayal. He found fear. People weren't actively conspiring against him. They were simply terrified, terrified of choosing wrong, terrified of backing a duke who might be removed, terrified of the violence coming when the Spring Council convened and the various factions finally collided, and that fear made them unreliable, made them hesitant, made them exactly the kind of wavering support that collapsed under pressure. His father's empire was held together by fear of the duke himself, but Caedric had let that fear erode by showing compassion. And now he was learning that fear was easier to maintain than loyalty. Another lesson his father had tried to teach him. Elara found him in his study late one night, staring at maps and troop deployments. She didn't ask permission before entering, just closed the door and sat across from him. "You haven't slept in 3 days. Sleep is a luxury I can't afford. Sleep is necessary for making good decisions." She leaned forward. "You're running yourself into the ground trying to control everything when you can't control any of this. I can control how I respond to it. Can you? Because from where I'm sitting, you look like a man being pulled in a dozen directions while trying to convince himself he's still steering." The observation was too accurate. Caedric set down the map he'd been studying and rubbed his face. "They're going to move against me at the council. I have maybe 40% territorial support. Blackmore has the rest. And even if I survive the political maneuvering, there's still the assassination attempt. So we don't go to the council. I have to go. Refusing would be seen as cowardice. It would destroy what little authority I have left. Then we go prepared." She stood and moved around the desk. "Stop trying to fight this like your father would have. Stop obsessing over fear and control and brutal displays of power. Fight it like you. Like the man who actually cares about whether his decisions hurt people. They'll call that weakness. Let them. Better to lose as yourself than win as his ghost." The words hit something fundamental, some choice he'd been avoiding since the day his father died. He could keep trying to be the ruthless duke everyone expected, keep fighting battles using tactics designed by a dead tyrant, or he could accept that he'd fundamentally changed and find a different way to fight. The first path led to becoming his father. The second might lead to his death. But at least the second was honest. "I need you with me at the council," he said quietly. "Not hidden away or protected. With me. Visible. That's what they want. Proof that I've compromised you. Then let's give them proof. Let's make it absolutely clear that I'm choosing you over their approval. And if they want to remove me for that, they'll have to do it violently in front of everyone. You're using me as a dare. I'm using us as a statement that I'd rather lose power than lose what actually matters." Elara studied him for a long moment. "And if they call that bluff? If they actually try to kill you? Then you run. Get out of the council hall and don't look back. I'm not leaving you. Elara, please." "No." She moved closer until they were inches apart. "You stood beside me when my father died, when my entire world collapsed. I'm not abandoning you when yours does the same." The Spring Council convened under gray skies and rising tension. Nobles from across the northern territories gathered in the massive council hall, a stone cathedral of power where territorial law was debated and duke authority either confirmed or challenged. Caedric arrived with Elara at his side and armed guards surrounding them both. The message was clear. He was aware of the threat, he was prepared for violence, and he was done apologizing for caring about her. The hall fell silent when they entered. 12 rows of seats curved around a central floor where the Duke's throne sat elevated above everyone else. Blackmore and his coalition occupied the left section, nearly 40 nobles wearing expressions ranging from hostile to coldly calculating. Caedric's remaining supporters filled the right section, maybe 30 people looking nervous and outnumbered. The center section was empty. Undecided families waiting to see which way the power shifted before committing. Caedric took his throne. Elara stood beside it, refusing a seat, making herself a visible target. Lord Blackmore stood immediately. "Your Grace, this council has been convened to address serious concerns about your governance. Multiple noble families have petitioned for review of your fitness to rule. The formality was theater. Everyone knew what this really was. State your concerns," Caedric said flatly. "Your policies have deviated substantially from established Blackwood governance. You've granted unprecedented debt relief. You've reduced enforcement penalties. You've elevated an untitled woman to positions of influence typically reserved for nobility. These actions suggest either incompetence or compromised judgment, or compassion," Caedric said, "though I understand that's unfamiliar territory for some of you." A few people in his section laughed nervously. Blackmore's expression darkened. Compassion that bankrupts the territory is indistinguishable from incompetence. We're here to determine whether you're capable of maintaining your father's legacy or whether new leadership is required. New leadership meaning you. I serve at the territory's pleasure, as do you. If the council determines you're unfit, someone must replace you. Kedrick leaned forward. Let's dispense with the political theater, Blackmore. You're not concerned about my governance. You're concerned I'm not brutal enough for your tastes. You want the old Duke back, the one who ruled through terror and murder, the one who would have had you executed for conspiracy already. The accusation hung in the air. Blackmore's smile was cold. I've conspired against nothing. I've simply organized concerned nobility who worry about the territory's future. You organized the fire that killed Lord Ashford. The words detonated through the hall like explosives. Gasps, whispers, several nobles standing in shock. Blackmore's expression didn't change. That's a serious accusation. It's a statement of fact. Kedrick pulled out the letter Lady Ashford had recovered. You attempted to blackmail Ashford into testifying against me. When he refused, you had his estate burned with him inside it. I have the evidence right here. He held up the letter for everyone to see. Blackmore barely glanced at it. A letter proves nothing, and making wild accusations during a formal council session only reinforces concerns about your judgment. Then how about a witness? Kedrick looked toward the entrance. Bring him in. Guards opened the massive doors and escorted Marcus into the hall. He looked thinner than a week ago, paler, but his eyes were clear. The hall erupted. Marcus Blackwood had been the Duke's cousin, his closest advisor. Seeing him in chains was like watching the foundation crack. Tell them, Kedrick said quietly. Marcus looked at Blackmore, then at Kedrick, then out at the assembled nobles. And for a moment it seemed like he might actually confess, might actually expose the full conspiracy. Instead he smiled. I have nothing to say except that my cousin has lost his mind. He imprisoned me without cause after that woman, Marcus pointed at Elara, convinced him I was disloyal. This is exactly what we warned would happen. Personal feelings compromising judgment, paranoia replacing reason. The betrayal cut twice, once when Kedrick discovered it, again now when Marcus chose to protect the conspiracy, even from chains. Blackmore stood again. You see? The Duke imprisons family members based on paranoid suspicion. He makes accusations without proof. He brings his mistress to formal council and expects us to treat her like nobility. This is not governance, this is madness. And that was the moment the doors exploded inward. Not metaphorically. Actually exploded. Wood and stone fragments showered the hall as armed men poured through the opening, 30 soldiers wearing Blackmore's colors, swords drawn, violence no longer hidden behind political procedure. The assassination had begun. Kedrick was moving before conscious thought, pulling Elara behind his throne as chaos erupted. His guards formed a defensive line, but they were outnumbered and caught off balance. Nobles screamed and fled toward side exits. Blackmore's coalition stood calmly, clearly expecting this, clearly part of the plan. This was never about a vote, Kedrick realized. This was always about murder dressed as justice. Stay behind me, he said to Elara, drawing his sword. Like hell. She grabbed a dagger from a fallen guard. We fight together or not at all. There wasn't time to argue. The soldiers came fast and coordinated, cutting through Kedrick's outnumbered guards like harvesting wheat. He met the first attacker with brutal efficiency, years of training taking over. Steel clashed against steel. Blood sprayed across marble floors. Elara fought beside him with desperate ferocity, protecting his blind side, moving like she'd been preparing for this moment her entire life. They carved through 6 men before the mathematics became undeniable. There were too many. Kedrick felt something slice across his ribs. Pain bloomed hot and immediate. He stumbled and Elara caught him, dragging him back toward the throne while soldiers closed in from all sides. This was how he died. Not in bed like his father, but in the council hall fighting a coup while the woman he loved tried desperately to save him. And then the windows shattered. More soldiers poured through, but these wore different colors. These were his father's old guard. Men who'd retired or been reassigned. Veterans who'd served the Blackwoods for decades. Led by a woman Kedrick recognized as Captain Sarah Thorne, his father's most trusted military commander. She cut through Blackmore's soldiers with surgical precision, her veterans forming a protective ring around Keedric and Elara. "Thought you might need help," she said grimly. "Your father asked me to watch over you if things went bad." Guess they went bad. The tide turned fast. Blackmore's soldiers were good, but Sarah's veterans were legends. Within minutes, the coup collapsed into panicked retreat. Blackmore tried to flee through a side exit and ran directly into Sarah's blade at his throat. "Going somewhere?" she asked pleasantly. The council hall looked like an abattoir. Bodies everywhere, blood pooling between ancient stones. The political theater had become literal carnage. Keedric stood slowly, Elara supporting him, and looked out at the nobles who'd survived. Some of Blackmore's coalition, some of his own supporters, all of them staring at him with expressions ranging from terror to shock. He was covered in blood, wounded, standing only because the woman beside him refused to let him fall. And he'd never been more certain of what came next. "This is my territory," he said quietly, but his voice carried through the ruined hall. "Not my father's, not Blackmore's. Mine. And I will rule it as I choose. With compassion when possible, with brutality when necessary, and with loyalty to people who deserve it, rather than fear of everyone indiscriminately." He looked directly at the surviving members of Blackmore's coalition. "You have a choice. Swear loyalty to me right now in front of everyone, or leave this territory permanently. You have 10 seconds. 9 of them knelt immediately. The rest fled. Keedric turned to Sarah. "What do we do with him?" He gestured to Blackmore, still held at sword point. Sarah looked at Elara. "What does the lady think?" All eyes shifted to Elara. She stood beside Keedric's throne covered in blood that wasn't hers, holding a dagger, looking every inch the vengeful daughter. "Trial," she said finally, "public, with all evidence presented, so everyone knows exactly what he did and why he dies for it." Keedric felt something shift in his chest. Relief, maybe. Or pride. She could have demanded immediate execution, could have buried the dagger in Blackmore's throat herself. Instead, she chose justice over vengeance, chose to be better than the system that killed her father. "Take him to the dungeons," Keedric said. "We'll convene a proper trial once the territory stabilizes." As guards dragged Blackmore away, screaming threats and promises of revenge, Keedric finally let himself collapse. The wound in his side was worse than he'd realized, blood soaking through his shirt, vision starting to blur. Elara caught him before he hit the ground. "Stay with me," she said urgently. "You don't get to die after finally figuring out how to live." "I'm not dying." His voice was weak, just resting. "Medic!" she screamed. "Someone get a medic now!" The world was fading to gray around the edges. Keedric could hear voices, feel hands lifting him, sense movement toward somewhere hopefully safe. But the last thing he saw before darkness took him was Elara's face above his, fierce and terrified and absolutely certain. And he understood in that final conscious moment that his father had been wrong about everything. Love wasn't a liability. It was the only thing worth surviving for. Pain dragged Keedric back to consciousness like hands pulling him from deep water. His side felt like someone had driven hot iron through the muscle and left it there to burn. Every breath was a negotiation with agony. He opened his eyes to find stone ceiling above him and candlelight flickering shadows across familiar walls. His bedroom at Blackwood Manor. "How long?" His voice came out raw. Elara materialized beside the bed immediately, her face exhausted but relieved. 3 days. The wound was infected. The physician said you might not wake up. But I did. But you did. She sat on the edge of the bed, careful not to jostle him. "Sarah's been holding the territory together while you've been unconscious. Blackmore's in the dungeons awaiting trial. The council members who fled have been declared traitors with bounties on their heads. And Marcus? Still imprisoned. He's asking to see you." Keedric tried to sit up and immediately regretted it. Fire shot through his torso and he fell back gasping. Elara pressed a hand to his chest, holding him down. "Don't move. You're not healed yet. I need to get up, need to address the territory, show them I'm still in control. You nearly died 3 days ago. Control can wait 24 hours. But she was wrong, and they both knew it. In the brutal mathematics of power, weakness invited challenge. 3 days unconscious was 3 days for doubt to spread, for rival factions to reorganize, for the careful stability he'd built to fracture under pressure. He couldn't afford to look vulnerable, even if he was. "Help me up," he said quietly. "Keedric, please." She stared at him for a long moment, then sighed and moved to support his shoulders. Together they got him vertical, sweat pouring down his face from the effort. The room spun briefly before stabilizing. His side screamed protest, but he gritted through it. Standing was a victory measured in inches. "Get Sarah," he said once he could breathe normally again. "And Aldrich. I need a full report on territorial status and which families are still wavering. You need rest. I need to rule. There's a difference." Elara looked like she wanted to argue, but recognized the futility. She left to find Sarah while Cadric stood there gripping the bedpost and trying not to collapse. His reflection in the window glass looked like something from a nightmare. Pale, gaunt, covered in bandages and dried blood. He looked like a man barely surviving instead of a duke commanding respect. His father's voice echoed from memory, sharp and unforgiving. "Show weakness, and you invite destruction. A ruler governs from strength or doesn't govern at all." But his father had also taught him that love was liability, that compassion was failure, that only fear maintained order. And all those lessons had nearly gotten him killed by the very system of terror they were designed to protect. Maybe strength looked different than his father believed. Maybe it looked like standing despite the pain, like choosing justice over revenge, like loving someone openly even when it made you vulnerable. Or maybe he was just desperate to justify decisions that were going to destroy everything anyway. Sarah Thorne entered without knocking, her armor still showing dents from the council hall battle. She took one look at Cadric standing and shook her head. "You're an idiot." Noted. "What's the territorial status?" "Tense but holding." Most of Blackmore's coalition scattered after the coup failed. A few diehards are holed up in the southern estates claiming you staged the whole thing to justify tyranny. She crossed her arms. "They're calling you a murderer who killed innocent nobles under the pretense of stopping conspiracy. Are they gathering support? Some. Maybe 15% of territorial military strength. Not enough to threaten you directly, but enough to cause problems if they coordinate with external enemies." External meaning what? Meaning the crown is paying attention. Sarah's expression darkened. "You had a massacre in the council hall. That kind of violence gets noticed in the capital. There are rumors the king might send investigators to determine whether you're fit to maintain order or whether the territory needs direct royal oversight. The implications were catastrophic. Royal oversight meant losing autonomy. It meant bureaucrats from the capital dictating policy. It meant everything his family had built for generations being stripped away because he couldn't maintain control. When are these investigators arriving? 2 weeks, maybe less. Then we have 2 weeks to stabilize the territory completely. Cadric looked at her. "I want the trial for Blackmore held publicly in 5 days. I want every piece of evidence presented transparently. And I want the verdict to be so obviously justified that no one can claim I'm executing political opponents arbitrarily. And if Blackmore's allies use the trial to incite more violence, then we put down the violence and hold the trial anyway. I'm done hiding from threats." Sarah studied him carefully. "Your father would have just executed Blackmore quietly and buried the conspiracy with him. My father's methods created the instability we're dealing with now. I'm trying something different. Different might get you killed. Then I die trying." The conviction in his voice surprised even himself. 3 days ago, he'd been willing to fight and kill to maintain power. Now he was willing to risk everything for a principle his father would have mocked as naive. But standing there with his side still bleeding and his empire teetering on collapse, Cadric understood something fundamental. He wasn't fighting to preserve his father's legacy anymore. He was fighting to build something new, something that might actually last beyond fear and brutality, even if it killed him. Over the next 4 days, Blackwood Manor transformed into a fortress preparing for siege. Sarah brought in additional soldiers from loyal families. Cadric reviewed every detail of evidence against Blackmore, building a case so comprehensive that even his enemies would struggle to refute it. And Elara worked with Aldrich to identify which territorial families were still undecided, still waiting to see which way power shifted before committing. The list was longer than Cadric wanted to admit. He spent those days moving through the manor despite the physicians' protests, meeting with advisors, reinforcing alliances, showing everyone he was still functional despite the wound that should have killed him. Every step hurt. Every conversation required focus he barely maintained. But appearing weak now would invite the exact challenges he couldn't afford. So he performed strength even while bleeding beneath the facade. On the 3rd day, he finally visited Marcus in the dungeons. The cells beneath Blackwood Manor were older than the manor itself, carved from bedrock when the first Blackwoods claimed this territory through conquest. They were cold and lightless except for torches that cast everything in orange shadow. Marcus sat in the farthest cell, thinner than when Kaedric had seen him last, staring at stone walls. He looked up when Kaedric approached. "Come to gloat?" Kaedric pulled a chair close to the bars and sat carefully, his side protesting. "Came to understand." "Understand what? Why I betrayed you? I already explained. You were weak. You thought I was weak. There's a difference." Marcus laughed bitterly. "Is there? You changed every policy our father established. You let that woman turn you into something soft. You proved that love compromises judgment exactly like he warned us it would. And yet I survived. The coup failed. Blackmore's awaiting execution. I'm still Duke. For now." Marcus leaned forward. "But you're bleeding support with every compassionate decision. Eventually someone else will try what Blackmore tried, and eventually they'll succeed. Maybe." Kaedric held his cousin's gaze. "Or maybe I'm building something more stable than what our father left behind. Something that doesn't require constant violence to maintain. That's naive. That's hope. Hope is what weak men cling to when they can't face reality." Marcus's voice hardened. "You want to know what I really think? I think you're terrified of becoming our father. So terrified that you've swung completely the opposite direction. But leadership isn't about being nice or cruel. It's about making the decisions that keep your people alive. Even when those decisions are brutal." "You're right," Kaedric said quietly. "Leadership is about keeping people alive. But our father's methods killed more people than they saved. Fear might maintain order temporarily, but it also creates the exact conspiracies that just tried to murder me. I'm trying to build something that doesn't eat itself from the inside. By trusting people who don't deserve trust, by giving them reasons to be trustworthy." Marcus shook his head. "You're going to die believing that. And when you do, this territory will collapse into chaos because you spent more time building ideals than building walls. Then I'll die with ideals. Better than dying with nothing but fear." He stood to leave, each movement a reminder of how close he'd come to dying already. "Kaedric," Marcus called out. "For what it's worth, I am sorry. You're my family. Betraying you was the hardest thing I've ever done, but you did it anyway, because I believed it was necessary." Marcus's expression was earnest despite the circumstances. "I still believe that. You're not equipped for this world. You're too good, and eventually that goodness will destroy you." The words followed Kaedric as he climbed the stairs back to the manor proper. They echoed in his mind while he reviewed trial preparations. They haunted him during late-night meetings with Sarah about territorial security, because part of him wondered if Marcus was right, if compassion really was incompatible with survival, if loving Elara had compromised his ability to make the brutal choices that kept empires intact. He found her that night in the library, reading by candlelight. She looked up when he entered and immediately set aside her book. "You're in pain, always. I mean more than usual." She stood and moved toward him. "You're limping worse than this morning. The wound's not healing as fast as it should." He lowered himself into a chair across from her. "The physician thinks I pushed too hard too fast." Shocking. She sat beside him. What did Marcus say? That I'm too good for this world and it's going to kill me. He's not entirely wrong. Kaedric looked at her sharply. "You agree with him?" "I agree you're different than your father. Better in most ways, but also more vulnerable because you actually care what happens to people." Elara leaned forward. "That's not weakness, though. That's courage. It takes more strength to care in a world like this than to just stop feeling altogether. Marcus would call that rationalization. Marcus betrayed you to preserve a system that was already failing. His opinion stopped mattering the moment he chose conspiracy over family. She was right, but the doubt still gnawed. The trial for Blackmore was held 5 days after the coup attempt in the same council hall where blood still stained marble floors. Every territorial noble who could travel attended, along with merchants, farmers, common citizens. Kaedric had ordered the proceedings open to everyone, transparency as weapon against accusations of tyranny. Blackmore was brought in wearing chains, still defiant, still radiating contempt. He looked at Kaedric on the elevated throne and smiled like he knew something no one else did. The formal charges were read: conspiracy to commit murder, arson resulting in death, blackmail, attempted assassination of the Duke. Each charge was supported by evidence presented methodically and publicly. The letter to Lord Ashford. Testimony from servants who'd seen Blackmore's men near the Ashford estate the night of the fire. Financial records showing payments to Marcus Blackwood for intelligence. Survivor accounts from the Council Hall massacre. The case was overwhelming, but Blackmore remained composed throughout. And when finally given the chance to speak, he stood with the confidence of someone who believed he'd already won. "Everything presented here today is true," he said calmly. "I did conspire against Duke Cedric Blackwood. I did facilitate Lord Ashford's death. I did attempt to remove the Duke through violence." The hall erupted in shocked whispers. Cedric felt ice forming in his chest. This was wrong. Blackmore wasn't supposed to confess. He was supposed to fight, to deny, to give Cedric the satisfaction of proving guilt beyond doubt. But Blackmore was smiling like the confession itself was strategy. "I did all these things," Blackmore continued, "because the Duke is unfit to rule. He has betrayed everything the Blackwoods stand for. He has chosen personal feelings over territorial security. He has elevated a common woman to positions of power based solely on his infatuation with her. He has turned this territory into a laughingstock." Cedric stood. "You're confessing to murder and calling it justified?" "I'm confessing to attempted correction of a fundamental problem." Blackmore's voice carried through the hall. "Your father understood that rulers must sacrifice personal happiness for public good. You've done the opposite. You've sacrificed territorial stability for a woman. That makes you weak. That makes you dangerous. And that makes removing you not just justified, but necessary." The argument was surgical. Blackmore wasn't denying guilt. He was reframing it as patriotic duty, turning the trial into referendum on Cedric's fitness to rule. And from the expressions around the hall, some people were buying it. "You killed an innocent man," Cedric said coldly. "You burned down his home with his family inside. I removed a weak link who might have compromised the operation." Blackmore looked directly at Elara. "And I'd do it again, because people like Lord Ashford and his daughter represent everything wrong with modern governance. Sentiment over strength, mercy over justice, love over duty." He was baiting them, trying to provoke an emotional response that would prove his point about compromised judgment. Elara stood before Cedric could stop her. "You talk about duty and strength like they're incompatible with decency." She moved down from the elevated platform to the main floor, standing directly in front of Blackmore. "My father was a flawed man who made terrible decisions, but he was also a human being with a family who loved him. You murdered him not because he was weak, but because he wouldn't help you destroy someone you feared. I don't fear the Duke." "Yes, you do." Elara's voice was steady. "You fear what he represents: change, evolution, the possibility that power doesn't have to be maintained through terror. You fear becoming irrelevant in a world that's outgrown the brutal methods you worship. So you tried to kill him and frame it as territorial preservation." The hall had gone completely silent. Blackmore stared at her with undisguised contempt. "You're exactly the infection I warned about. The moment a ruler starts valuing one person's life over territorial stability, the entire system collapses. Your father died because he was connected to a larger problem. His death was unfortunate, but necessary. My father died because you're a coward who couldn't compete politically, so you resorted to murder. I'm a realist who understands that empires aren't built on feelings. Then your empire deserves to fall." The exchange was electric. Everyone in the hall watched these two people embodying fundamentally different philosophies of power clash in real time. And Cedric understood in that moment what the trial really was. Not just judgment on Blackmore's crimes, but judgment on which vision of leadership the territory would support going forward. He stood carefully, pain shooting through his side. "Lord Blackmore has confessed to multiple capital crimes. The evidence is overwhelming. The verdict is obvious. He will be executed at dawn tomorrow for treason, murder, and attempted assassination." Blackmore smiled again, and this time there was something triumphant in it. "Kill me and you prove my point, that you're no different than your father. That all your talk of compassion and change is just performance hiding the same brutality underneath." The trap snapped shut. If Cedric executed Blackmore, he confirmed accusations of tyranny. If he showed mercy, he looked weak in front of the entire territory. There was no winning move, just degrees of losing. Unless Cedric looked at Elara, then at Sarah, then back at the assembled nobles. He could feel his father's ghost watching from the portraits lining the walls. Could feel generations of Blackwood brutality pressing down like atmospheric pressure. And he made a choice his father would have called suicide. Lord Blackmore's crimes are unforgivable, Execution is the prescribed penalty, but I'm not my father, and I won't perpetuate his cycle of violence disguised as justice. He looked directly at Blackmore. Instead, you'll spend the rest of your life imprisoned. No execution, no martyrdom. Just years to contemplate exactly how wrong you were about what makes a ruler strong. The hall exploded in shocked reaction. Blackmore's smile vanished, replaced by genuine fury. You're making a mistake. Maybe. Kedrick's voice was steady. But it's my mistake to make. And I'd rather err toward mercy than brutality. He sat back down while chaos erupted around him. Nobles arguing, factions fracturing. The careful stability he'd been building disintegrating in real time. Sarah appeared at his side immediately, her voice urgent. You just showed weakness in front of everyone who matters. They'll interpret mercy as fear. Let them. Kedrick, this is exactly what Blackmore wanted. He's going to spin this as proof you're unfit. His allies will use it to justify more violence. Then we'll deal with more violence. He looked at her. I'm done making decisions based on fear of how they'll be perceived. Blackmore confessed to murder. He doesn't get to become a martyr because execution would make me look bad. You're gambling the entire territory on a principle. Yes, I am. Over the next 3 days, the gamble looked catastrophic. 5 territorial families who'd been undecided declared for Blackmore's imprisoned faction. 3 merchant guilds withdrew their support. Rumors spread that the Duke had gone soft, that his woman had made him weak, that the territory needed new leadership before complete collapse. The pressure was immense and building. Royal investigators arrived on the 4th day. 3 officials from the capital wearing expensive clothes and cold expressions. They installed themselves in guest quarters and began interviewing everyone about territorial stability and the Duke's fitness to rule. Kedrick answered their questions with transparency that probably looked like desperation. Yes, he'd changed policies. Yes, he'd granted debt relief. Yes, he'd elevated Elara to advisory positions. Yes, he'd shown mercy to a confessed murder instead of executing him. He explained his reasoning for each decision, laid out the economic analysis showing his methods were working, presented testimony from common citizens about improved conditions. But he could see in their eyes they'd already decided. They thought he was weak. On the 7th day, the investigators requested a private meeting. Kedrick entered the council room to find all 3 seated with documents spread before them. The lead investigator, a man named Lord Pemberton with silver hair and calculating eyes, gestured for Kedrick to sit. Your Grace, we've completed our preliminary assessment. And, Pemberton folded his hands, the territory is experiencing significant instability. Multiple factions are openly challenging your authority. Your policy changes, while well-intentioned, have created confusion about enforcement standards. And your personal relationship with Lady Ashford has become a focal point for opposition. She's not the problem. People uncomfortable with change are the problem, perhaps. But perception matters in governance. Pemberton leaned forward. The Crown is concerned that this territory is sliding towards civil war. We're here to determine whether you're capable of preventing that, or whether direct royal oversight is required. I'm capable. Are you? Because from where we're sitting, it looks like you've inherited a brutal but stable system and systematically dismantled it without having a sustainable replacement ready. That's not leadership. That's idealism without practical implementation. The criticism was surgical and accurate. Change is messy, Kedrick said carefully. My father's system worked through fear. Fear is cheap and effective short-term, but it's also unstable. I'm building something more sustainable. By showing mercy to a man who tried to murder you? By refusing to perpetuate cycles of violence that create the exact conspiracies you're investigating. That's philosophy. We need results. Then give me time to deliver results. Pemberton exchanged glances with his colleagues. Your Grace, we're going to recommend provisional oversight. The Crown will assign an administrative council to help stabilize the territory while you continue implementing reforms. Think of it as support rather than replacement. But it was replacement. Kedrick knew how these things worked. Administrative council was code for stripping his authority while maintaining the fiction of his title. He'd become a figurehead while bureaucrats ran his territory. Everything his family had built, gone. How long do I have before this oversight begins? 2 weeks. Pemberton stood. Use that time wisely. Show us the territory can be managed peacefully or accept that change might require more than good intentions. They left Kaedric sitting alone in the council room, staring at maps that suddenly felt like someone else's property. He found Elara on the battlements overlooking the northern fields. She stood wrapped in a heavy cloak against the cold, watching snow fall across land that had belonged to the Blackwoods for 6 generations. She turned when he approached, and something in his expression made her face fall. How bad? They're recommending administrative oversight. I have 2 weeks to prove I can maintain stability or lose everything. Elara moved closer. Then we prove it. How? Half the territory thinks I'm weak. The other half is waiting to see if the crown validates that belief. I've got enemies organizing and allies wavering and exactly 0 margin for error. So we eliminate the margin for error. She looked at him directly. The family's still supporting Blackmore's faction. Where are they concentrated? Southern estates. Why? Because they're organizing a response to the trial verdict, probably planning more violence to prove you can't maintain order. She grabbed his arm. We don't wait for them to attack. We move first. That's what my father would have done. Good. Maybe he was right about something. Kaedric stared at her. You're seriously suggesting I launch a preemptive strike against territorial nobles? I'm suggesting you stop letting fear of looking tyrannical prevent you from defending your territory. She squeezed his arm. There's a difference between brutal for the sake of brutality and brutal because it's necessary. You've been so careful to prove you're not your father that you've forgotten. Sometimes force is the only language certain people understand. If I attack them, I validate every accusation Blackmore made about me. If you don't attack them, they'll eventually come for you and everyone you care about. She held his gaze. You can't build something new while the old system is actively trying to destroy you. Sometimes you have to burn down what's broken before you can rebuild. The words hit something deep, some truth he'd been avoiding since his father died. He'd spent months trying to be different than the old Duke, trying to prove compassion could coexist with strength, trying to rule through fairness instead of fear. But maybe the problem wasn't choosing between those philosophies. Maybe it was recognizing when each was required. His father had been wrong about ruling exclusively through terror. But Kaedric was also wrong about ruling exclusively through mercy. Real leadership meant understanding which tool solved which problem. And right now, the problem required force. He looked at Elara and saw something that should have terrified him. She wasn't pushing him toward violence out of bloodlust or revenge. She was pushing him toward strategic brutality, born from understanding that some enemies would never stop until they were stopped permanently. She'd learned the lesson he'd been trying to avoid, that sometimes mercy got you killed. Get Sarah, he said quietly. Tell her to mobilize every loyal soldier we have. We're moving against the southern estates tomorrow at dawn. All of them? Every single one that's still supporting Blackmore's faction. We're going to prove I can maintain order. And if that requires reminding people why they should fear the Blackwood name, then that's what we'll do. Elara smiled, and it was sharp enough to draw blood. Now you're thinking like a duke. She left to find Sarah, and Kaedric stood alone on the battlements, watching snow cover everything in white. He thought about his father, about Marcus, about all the warnings that love would compromise his judgment, and he realized they'd been half right. Love had changed him, made him softer in some ways, but it had also given him something worth fighting for, worth being brutal for, worth burning down enemies for. His father had ruled alone, trusting no one, loving nothing except power itself. Kaedric was going to rule beside someone who made him both better and more dangerous. And together, they were going to remind the territory exactly what happened when you mistook evolution for weakness. The war planning took all night. Sarah spread maps across the council table while Kaedric, Elara, and his remaining loyal nobles plotted coordinates for simultaneous strikes. 5 estates, roughly 200 enemy soldiers total. The goal wasn't occupation or negotiation, it was elimination. They're going to call this a massacre, one of the nobles said nervously. Let them, Kaedric responded. Better to be feared than pitied. By dawn, 600 soldiers were assembled in the courtyard, armed and ready. Kaedric stood before them despite the wound in his side, still bleeding beneath bandages. He looked at faces ranging from hardened veterans to young recruits who'd never seen real combat. They needed to understand what they were marching toward. We're not going south to negotiate, he said, his voice carrying across the courtyard. We're going to remove a threat to territorial stability. Some of you will die today. All of you will carry what we do for the rest of your lives. But this is necessary. These families have chosen rebellion over loyalty, chosen violence over peace. And I will not allow this territory to collapse into chaos because I was too afraid to make hard decisions. He paused, letting the words settle. My father ruled through fear because fear worked. I've been trying to build something better, something based on trust and fairness. But trust only functions when both sides honor it. These families have rejected every opportunity for reconciliation. They've chosen war. So we're giving them war. The soldier stood silent, absorbing the brutality of what was coming. And somewhere in the back of his mind, Kedrick's father whispered approval that felt like condemnation. They rode south under gray skies with Sarah leading the vanguard and Elara beside Kedrick despite every argument about her staying safe. She'd refused to be left behind, insisted on seeing firsthand what her push toward violence accomplished. He both loved and hated her for that. The First Estate fell before noon. The noble family had fortified their manor poorly, expecting political maneuvering rather than direct assault. Sarah's veterans breached the gates in under an hour. The fighting was vicious and short. By the time Kedrick entered the main hall, 17 bodies littered marble floors, and the surviving family knelt in surrender. The patriarch, Lord Ashton, looked up at Kedrick with defiant hatred. "You'll hang for this. The crown will see this as tyranny. The crown gave me 2 weeks to prove I can maintain order." Kedrick's voice was cold. "This is me maintaining order. By murdering noble families? By removing rebels who chose violence over loyalty." He gestured to Sarah, who stepped forward with a document. "Every person in this estate is hereby stripped of title and lands. You have 24 hours to vacate the territory. Anyone still here tomorrow dies." Lord Ashton's expression crumbled. "You can't. This land has been in my family for 4 generations. Should have thought about that before backing Blackmore's conspiracy." They moved to the second estate, then the third. Each fell with brutal efficiency. Each family was given the same ultimatum: leave or die. Some fled immediately. Others tried to negotiate and learned that negotiation time had passed. By the time they reached the fifth estate, word had spread. The remaining rebels had consolidated there. Nearly 100 soldiers prepared for siege warfare behind thick walls and iron gates. This one would cost blood. Sarah assessed the fortifications grimly. "We can take it, but we'll lose maybe 50 soldiers doing it. Is it worth the cost?" Kedrick looked at the fortress. Inside were the last organized remnants of resistance to his rule, the families who'd pushed hardest for his removal, the nobles who'd called him weak and predicted his downfall. If he walked away now, they'd interpret it as vindication. If he attacked, 50 families would lose sons and fathers. Beside him, Elara waited for his decision without offering input. This was his choice to make, his burden to carry. And maybe that was the real lesson. Leadership wasn't about choosing between mercy and brutality. It was about accepting that sometimes there were no good choices, only less terrible ones. "We attack," he said quietly. "Full assault. I want this ended today." The siege began at twilight and lasted through the night. The rebel soldiers fought with desperation of people who knew surrender meant death or exile. Kedrick's forces pushed forward with brutal efficiency, taking casualties but never stopping, never giving the defenders time to regroup. Kedrick fought despite his wound reopening, despite pain that made every movement agony. He needed to be visible, needed his soldiers to see him bleeding beside them rather than commanding from safety. Elara stayed close, her dagger finding targets with precision that suggested she'd been preparing for violence longer than he'd realized. She moved through chaos like something born for it, and watching her fight was both beautiful and terrifying. This was who they'd become. 2 people trying to build something better by burning down everyone who stood in the way. The gates fell sometime after midnight. Sarah led the breach while Kedrick followed, cutting through defenders who wouldn't surrender. Blood soaked into stone, smoke filled halls. The screaming was constant and inhuman. By dawn, it was over. 73 rebel soldiers dead, 42 captured. The noble families who'd organized the resistance were dragged into the main courtyard, where Kedrick stood covered in blood that was mostly someone else's. They looked at him with expressions ranging from terror to resignation. And Kedrick understood he'd crossed a line he could never uncross. This wasn't defense. This was annihilation. This was exactly what his father would have done. "You have 24 hours, he said flatly, then burned every bridge behind him by adding, "And if I ever see any of you in my territory again, I'll kill you myself." They fled before he finished speaking. The ride back to Blackwood Manor took 3 days because of wounded soldiers and captured equipment. When they finally arrived, the courtyard was filled with townspeople who'd heard about the Southern campaign. Some looked grateful. Others looked horrified. All of them looked afraid. Cedric dismounted carefully, his wound bleeding again beneath armor, and found the royal investigators waiting on the manor steps. Lord Pemberton's expression was unreadable. "Your Grace, we've received reports about your actions in the Southern territories. Multiple estates burned, noble families exiled, approximately 100 casualties. Rebel casualties," Cedric corrected, "from families who chose violence over loyalty." That's one interpretation. Pemberton stepped closer. Another interpretation is that you launched an unprovoked attack on territorial nobles because they questioned your authority. That looks like tyranny. It looks like stability. Cedric held his gaze. "You gave me 2 weeks to prove I could maintain order. I've eliminated the organized resistance. The territory is secure. That's what you asked for. We asked for peaceful resolution. There's no peaceful resolution with people actively planning your assassination." He gestured to the wounded soldiers behind him. "These men bled to protect this territory from rebels who wanted to turn it into a battlefield. I won't apologize for defending what's mine." Pemberton studied him for a long moment. "You've become exactly what Blackmore accused you of being, a tyrant hiding brutality behind claims of necessity." "No," Cedric said quietly. "I've become what this territory requires, someone willing to make terrible decisions so other people don't have to. That's not tyranny, that's leadership." The investigator looked like he wanted to argue, but something in Cedric's expression stopped him. Maybe exhaustion. Maybe the cold certainty of someone who'd already accepted the cost of his choices. "We'll deliver our final report to the Crown," Pemberton said. "But I suspect you've just guaranteed administrative oversight regardless of territorial stability." "Then I'll fight that too." He walked past the investigators into his manor, leaving bloody footprints on marble floors. Elara followed close behind, and when they reached his private chambers and the door closed behind them, he finally let himself collapse. She caught him before he hit the ground. "You did what you had to," she said quietly. "I became my father." "No. You became yourself. The you that understands sometimes violence is necessary. That's not the same as being him." But Cedric wasn't sure she was right. He'd spent months trying to prove he could rule differently, trying to build something based on fairness and trust. And when that wasn't enough, when the pressure mounted and the threats multiplied, he'd fallen back on exactly the brutal tactics his father taught him. Maybe Marcus had been right all along. Maybe he was always going to become the monster regardless of what he tried to build. The thought followed him into unconsciousness as exhaustion and blood loss dragged him under. And in his dreams, his father smiled with something that looked almost like pride. Cedric woke to gray morning light and the metallic taste of failure in his mouth. His side throbbed with the dull persistence of a wound that refused to heal properly, a physical reminder that some damage couldn't be fixed through willpower alone. The room was silent except for wind against the windows and the distant sound of manor staff beginning their daily routines. 3 weeks had passed since the Southern campaign. 3 weeks of waiting for the royal investigator's final report. 3 weeks of watching his territory hold together through exhausted momentum rather than actual stability. He'd become exactly what he swore he wouldn't be, and the knowledge sat in his chest like a stone. Elara was already awake, standing by the window watching snow fall across the northern fields. She'd been distant since they returned from the siege, not angry exactly, but quieter, like she was processing something too heavy to speak aloud. "You're thinking too loud," she said without turning around. Cedric sat up slowly, every movement a negotiation with pain. "I'm thinking we burned down half the territory to prove I could maintain order, and now we're waiting to find out if that was enough, or if I just guaranteed losing everything anyway." She turned to face him. "Do you regret it?" The question deserved honesty. "I regret that it was necessary. I regret that people died because I couldn't find a better solution. But do I regret removing threats to territorial stability? No. Those families would have kept pushing until someone died. Better them than us. That's what your father would have said." "I know." He stood carefully, moving to the window beside her. "I spent months trying to prove I was different than him, that I could rule through fairness instead of fear. And the moment the pressure mounted, I fell right back into his playbook. Maybe Marcus was right. Maybe I was always going to become the monster. Or maybe you're just learning that leadership isn't about choosing between being good or brutal. Maybe it's about understanding when each is required. She looked at him. Your father was brutal all the time because he didn't know any other way. You tried compassion first. You gave people chances to choose differently. They rejected those chances. What happened after wasn't you becoming him. It was you adapting to reality. Kadrick wanted to believe her, wanted to accept that the violence he'd authorized was strategic necessity rather than moral failure. But standing there looking at the territory he'd just bled to protect, he couldn't escape the feeling that he'd traded one kind of tyranny for another. The only difference was this tyranny wore a more justified mask. A knock at the door interrupted his spiral. Aldrich's voice came through, apologetic and urgent as always. Your Grace, Lord Pemberton requests your presence in the council room immediately. He says the Crown's decision has arrived. The words landed like hammers. This was it. The moment that determined whether everything he'd built survived or collapsed entirely. Kadrick looked at Elara and saw his own fear reflected in her eyes. Whatever happens, she said quietly, we face it together. He nodded, unable to speak past the tightness in his throat. They dressed quickly and made their way through corridors that suddenly felt like walking toward execution. Servants stepped aside with careful deference, their expressions impossible to read. Word had already spread that the royal decision was here. Everyone knew the next hour would reshape the territory's future. Lord Pemberton waited in the council room with his two colleagues, all three standing around the table where a sealed letter sat like unexploded ordnance. The investigator's expression was professionally neutral, which meant nothing good. Your Grace, Lady Ashford. Pemberton gestured to chairs. Please sit. I'll stand, Kadrick said. Whatever you're about to tell me, I'd rather face it on my feet. A flicker of something crossed Pemberton's face. Respect, maybe? Or pity? He broke the seal and unfolded the letter, reading in silence for a moment before looking up. The Crown has reviewed our report regarding territorial stability and your fitness to rule. After careful consideration of all evidence, including the recent military action in the southern estates, they've reached a decision. The pause felt eternal. You will retain your position as Duke of the Northern Territories. However, this retention comes with conditions. First, a permanent advisory council will be appointed to provide oversight on major policy decisions. Second, quarterly reports on territorial status must be submitted to the Crown for review. Third, any further military action against noble families requires prior royal approval. Pemberton set down the letter. Essentially, Your Grace, you remain Duke in title, but your autonomy has been substantially curtailed. The Crown wants to ensure that recent violence doesn't become a pattern. The relief that he wasn't being removed entirely mixed with the bitter reality that he'd lost the independence his family had maintained for generations. He was still Duke, but a Duke on a leash held by distant bureaucrats who'd never understand this territory's complexity. So I won, Kadrick said flatly, but only technically. You survived, Pemberton corrected. Whether you won depends on what you do with what's left. He moved toward the door, his colleagues following. We'll be departing tomorrow morning. The advisory council will arrive within 2 weeks. I suggest you use that time to prepare the territory for this transition. After they left, Kadrick stood staring at the letter. All that violence, all those deaths, all the moral compromises and brutal decisions, and the result was conditional survival with his authority permanently diminished. It felt less like victory and more like structured defeat. You're still here, Elara said quietly. That's not nothing. It's not enough. Then make it enough. She moved to stand in front of him. You've spent so much energy trying to be something you're not, or avoiding becoming what you fear that you've forgotten to just be who you actually are. Flawed, complicated, capable of both compassion and brutality. That's not weakness. That's being human. Humans don't rule empires. Maybe that's the problem. Maybe empires need to be ruled by humans instead of monsters. The words hit something deep. Some truth he'd been circling without confronting. His father had made himself into a weapon, sharpening away everything human until only the tool remained. Kadrick had spent his entire adult life trying to avoid that fate while also trying to wield the same power. But you couldn't use a weapon without becoming one yourself. Not entirely. I need to see Marcus, he said suddenly. Elara's expression flickered. Why? Because he betrayed me to preserve a system he believed in. And I've spent weeks hating him for it without understanding that I did the same thing. I betrayed my own principles to preserve my rule. We're not that different. He's in a cell. You're still Duke. That's pretty different. In outcomes, yes. In motivations, no. We both sacrificed what we believed in when survival required it. Before she could argue, he was already moving toward the dungeons. The cells looked different in morning light filtering through narrow windows, less like horror and more like tired inevitability. Marcus sat in the same cell where Kaedric had left him weeks ago, thinner and paler but alert when his cousin appeared. "Come to gloat about surviving?" Marcus asked. Kaedric pulled the chair close to the bars and sat, came to apologize. That made Marcus blink. For what? For becoming exactly what you warned me I'd have to become. For proving your point about mercy being incompatible with survival. For hating you when you were just trying to protect something you believed in. Marcus studied him carefully. You look terrible. Wounded in the council hall attack. Reopened during the Southern campaign. The physician says I should be resting, but apparently I'm incapable of following medical advice. So you did launch this campaign. Marcus leaned forward. How many families did you destroy? 5 estates. Nearly 100 casualties. Complete exile for everyone involved. Kaedric's voice was flat. I proved I could maintain order through overwhelming force. The crown let me keep my title, but stripped most of my autonomy. I won, technically, but it feels like losing, because you had to abandon your principles to survive. Exactly. They sat in silence for a moment, 2 men who'd started as family and ended as enemies, finally finding common ground in mutual compromise of their ideals. I'm sorry I betrayed you, Marcus said quietly. Not sorry I tried, but sorry it was you I had to betray. You're my family. That should have mattered more than political philosophy. It did matter. That's why it hurt so much. What are you going to do with me? Execution? Permanent imprisonment? Kaedric had been wrestling with that question for weeks. Marcus had committed treason, had facilitated murder, had fed intelligence to enemies that nearly got Kaedric killed. By every legal and practical standard, he deserved death. But executing family felt like crossing a line Kaedric wasn't ready to cross. Not yet. Not ever, if he was being honest. I'm exiling you, he said finally. Out of the territory, far enough that you can't cause more problems, but not so far that I'm sentencing you to death. You leave tomorrow with enough money to start over somewhere else. And if I ever see you in my territory again, I'll execute you without hesitation. Those are the terms. Marcus stared at him. That's mercy. That's pragmatism. Killing you makes me feel better but doesn't solve anything. Exiling you removes the threat while preserving the option of reconciliation someday if circumstances change. You're hoping we can be family again eventually. I'm hoping I don't have to kill the only family I have left. The admission cost everything. Marcus looked down at his hands. For what it's worth, I think you'll be a better Duke than your father. Not because you're softer, but because you're willing to question yourself. He looked up. That's something the old man never did. Never even considered that his methods might be wrong. Too bad questioning myself nearly destroyed everything. But it didn't. You're still here, still in charge, still building something. Marcus smiled slightly. Even if you had to burn half the territory to protect it. They talked for another hour about nothing important. Childhood memories, shared history. The kind of conversation people have when they know they'll never see each other again and want to remember something good before the final separation. When Kaedric finally left the dungeons, he felt lighter somehow. Not forgiven, but maybe on the path toward forgiving himself, which was all anyone could really ask for. The next 2 weeks passed in careful reconstruction. Kaedric worked with Sarah to rebuild security, reviewed financial records with Aldrich to ensure the territory could absorb the economic impact of exiling 5 noble families, met with remaining territorial leaders to explain the new oversight structure and what it meant for local governance. And through it all, Elara was there. Not just as advisor or companion, but as partner. She attended meetings, offered perspectives, challenged decisions when she disagreed. She'd become essential to how he ruled, and everyone in the manor understood that whatever their relationship was, it had evolved far beyond the original debt arrangement. One evening, Kaedric found himself alone in his father's study. Now his study, staring at the portrait that dominated one wall. The old Duke looked down with those cold eyes that had taught Kaedric everything about power and nothing about living. You were wrong, Kaedric said to the painting, about almost everything. Fear doesn't build empires. It just builds larger prisons. And refusing to care about anyone doesn't make you strong. It just makes you alone. The portrait didn't answer, but Kedrick felt something release in his chest. Some final tie to his father's expectations cutting loose. He wasn't going to be the old Duke. He was going to be something new, something that didn't have a blueprint yet, something that required figuring out as he went. And maybe that was the real lesson. Leadership wasn't about following prescribed patterns or rejecting them entirely. It was about adapting, about taking pieces of what worked and discarding what didn't, about being willing to change when change was necessary and hold firm when principles mattered more than convenience. His father had never learned that, had died rigid and brutal and ultimately alone. Kedrick was determined to do better, even if better still required brutality sometimes. Elara found him there sometime after midnight, still staring at the portrait. She moved beside him without speaking, and they stood together in comfortable silence. "I've been thinking about what happens next," she said finally. "With us. With this territory. With everything we've built and destroyed to get here. And what did you conclude? That we're never going to be conventional. This relationship started as hostage situation and evolved into partnership through conspiracy and warfare. That's not exactly fairy tale material." "I wasn't expecting fairy tales." "Good. Because what I'm about to propose is practical rather than romantic." She turned to face him. "Marry me." The words took a moment to process. "What? Marry me. Make this official. Not because you love me, though I hope you do, but because the territory needs to see that I'm not temporary, that I'm not some mistress you'll discard when someone more politically advantageous comes along." She held his gaze. "Marry me so we can build something that lasts beyond crisis management." Kedrick stared at her. "You're proposing to me. Someone had to. You've been avoiding the question for weeks because you're worried it'll look like weakness. But here's the truth. Marrying me is the strongest move you can make. It shows commitment. It shows you're building a future rather than just surviving the present. It shows the crown and every territorial noble that you're not backing down from the changes you've implemented. That's the most unromantic proposal I've ever heard. You want romance?" She stepped closer. "Fine. I love you. You're difficult and complicated and capable of breathtaking cruelty when necessary. You're also trying desperately to be better than the monster who raised you, and that effort matters more than whether you always succeed. You've given me purpose when I had nothing left. You've made me stronger by not treating me like something fragile, and I want to spend whatever time we have left building something that might actually outlast us." Her voice softened. "So yes, this proposal is strategic, but it's also true. Marry me because you want to, not because you have to." Kedrick felt something crack open in his chest, some final defense crumbling. He'd spent months treating their relationship as complication rather than foundation, viewing Elara as weakness his enemies could exploit rather than strength that made him more effective. But she was right about all of it. Marrying her wasn't weakness. It was commitment to the vision of leadership he'd been building. It was choosing vulnerability as strength. It was accepting that some things mattered more than tactical advantage. It was choosing love in a world that punished such choices viciously. "Yes," he said quietly. "Yes, what?" "Yes, I'll marry you." He pulled her close. "Not because it's strategic, though it is, but because you're right, I love you. And I'm tired of pretending that's something to hide rather than something to build on." She kissed him then, fierce and certain, and for the first time in months, Kedrick felt like he was moving towards something instead of just running from his father's ghost. The wedding was held 3 weeks later in Blackwood Manor's Great Hall. It was smaller than traditional noble weddings, attended only by people who'd actually fought beside them rather than political allies performing obligation. Sarah stood as witness. Aldrich managed logistics. A handful of loyal territorial families filled the seats, while common citizens lined the corridors outside, curious about the Duke who'd turned his prisoner into his Duchess. Elara wore dark green rather than traditional white, a choice that generated whispers but perfectly captured who she was. Unconventional, defiant, refusing to perform expectations just because tradition demanded it. Kedrick stood at the front of the hall, watching her walk toward him, and understood this was the real beginning. Everything before had been survival. Everything after would be building something that might actually last. The vows were traditional, but the weight behind them was earned through blood and fire rather than gentle courtship. When Kedrick promised to stand beside her through whatever came next, he meant it with the certainty of someone who'd already lost almost everything and chosen her anyway. When Elara promised the same, Her voice carried the strength of someone who'd survived her own destruction and rebuilt herself into something sharper. They sealed the vows with a kiss that felt less like ending and more like promise. After the ceremony, during the celebration that was more gathering than formal ball, Kedrick found himself on the balcony overlooking the northern fields. The territory stretched dark and snow-covered beneath winter stars. And for the first time in months, he felt something like peace. Sarah joined him after a few minutes, holding 2 glasses of wine. She handed him one without speaking. "Your father would have hated this," she said finally. "I know." He believed marriage was political transaction, that love compromised judgment, that the only reliable loyalty came from fear. He was wrong about a lot of things. Sarah smiled slightly. Yes, he was. But he was also right about some things. Power is fragile. Enemies are persistent. Mercy has limits. She looked at him. "You're trying to balance his lessons with your own principles. That's harder than either extreme. Tell me about it." "The question I have is whether you found that balance or whether you're just exhausted from trying." Kedrick considered. "Probably both. I'm never going to be purely compassionate. I've learned that brutal decisions are sometimes necessary, but I'm also never going to be purely brutal. I've learned that terror alone builds unstable foundations. So what are you? Someone trying to build something better than what I inherited while accepting that better still requires compromise." He drank. "I don't know if that makes me a good duke or just a conflicted one. Maybe there's no difference. Maybe good leadership is just eternal conflict between ideals and reality. That's exhausting. That's life." They stood in comfortable silence while inside the celebration continued. Kedrick could hear Elara's laugh cutting through the general noise, sharp and genuine. And he smiled despite everything. "I'm going to fail sometimes," he said quietly. "Make wrong decisions. Be too brutal or too merciful at exactly the wrong moments. This territory is going to suffer because I'm still learning what the hell I'm doing." "Probably," Sarah finished her wine. "But you're also the first Blackwood in 3 generations who's actually trying to do something other than accumulate power for its own sake. That has to count for something. Let's hope it counts for enough." The months that followed were strange and difficult and occasionally hopeful. The advisory council arrived and proved less obstructive than Kedrick feared. They pushed back on some decisions but ultimately recognized he understood the territory better than distant bureaucrats ever could. The southern estates he'd destroyed were redistributed to loyal families with strict conditions about governance. No more autonomous fiefdoms. No more building personal armies. Everything subject to oversight that prevented the kind of factional power that had enabled Blackmore's conspiracy. The changes were gradual but steady. Debt relief policies continued, now backed by economic analysis showing they actually improved tax revenue long term. Enforcement became more consistent and less arbitrary. People stopped fleeing the territory in search of gentler rule. It wasn't perfect. Problems arose constantly. Rival nobles tested boundaries. Common citizens struggled with harvests and illness and all the regular tragedies of life that no duke could prevent. But the territory held together. Not through fear, not through unlimited compassion, through something between those extremes that Kedrick was learning to navigate without instruction manual. And through it all, Elara was there. She'd taken the title of Duchess and transformed it into something more active than traditional noble wives attempted. She worked with Aldrich on economic policy. She met with common citizens to understand their actual concerns rather than aristocratic assumptions about what they needed. She challenged Kedrick constantly, refusing to let him slip into either tyranny or paralysis. She made him better by refusing to let him be comfortable. One evening, almost a year after the wedding, Kedrick found her in the library reading correspondence from Lady Ashford. Her mother and sisters had settled in a neighboring territory, rebuilding their lives slowly with financial help Kedrick had quietly provided. "How are they?" he asked. "Surviving." Her voice carried complicated emotions. "My mother says the younger girls are being courted by local merchants. Nothing aristocratic, but decent matches." "That's good." "Is it?" She set down the letter. "Their lives were destroyed because my father made bad decisions, and you used me as leverage. Now they're living in reduced circumstances because of choices neither of them made." Kedrick sat across from her. "I can't undo what happened. Can't bring your father back or restore what your family lost. But I can make sure they're cared for going forward. That's guilt, not justice. It's responsibility, which is all I have left to offer." She looked at him for a long moment. "You've changed since the Southern campaign. You're quieter, more careful. I killed a lot of people to prove a point. That changes you. Does it make you regret marrying me, since I'm part of why all that violence was necessary? The question hung between them, heavy with real fear. No, Kaedric said firmly. I regret the circumstances that made violence necessary. But I don't regret choosing you, even knowing everything it would cost. Even understanding that loving you made me vulnerable in ways that nearly destroyed everything. I'd make the same choice again. Even though it turned you into something you swore you'd never become, I didn't become my father. I became someone who understands why my father made the choices he did while still trying to choose differently when possible. That's not the same as becoming him. Elara smiled slightly. You've been working on that rationalization for months. Doesn't make it wrong. She stood and moved to the window, looking out at the territory they'd bled to protect. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I'd refused to go with you that first day. If I'd let my father lose everything rather than becoming collateral for his debt, the territory would have collapsed faster. Kaedric joined her at the window. Blackmore would have moved sooner. I might be dead. You'd probably be married to some merchant's son and hating every minute of it. So everything that happened was inevitable. No. Just probable, given the circumstances. We made choices that led here. Different choices would have led somewhere else. Whether that somewhere would have been better or worse, I can't say. They stood together watching snow fall across the northern fields, and Kaedric felt something settle in his chest. Not peace exactly, more like acceptance that peace wasn't the goal. The goal was building something worth fighting for, even when the fight got ugly. The goal was surviving with enough humanity intact to remember why survival mattered. 2 years after the coup attempt, Kaedric stood in the rebuilt council hall, addressing the full assembly of territorial nobles. The hall looked different now, windows repaired, bloodstains scrubbed away, the architecture of violence hidden beneath fresh stone. But everyone remembered what had happened here. Everyone understood the price of rebellion. I've called this assembly to address questions about the future of territorial governance, Kaedric began. Over the past 2 years, we've implemented significant changes. Some of you supported those changes, some opposed them. But we're past the point of debate. These policies are now established fact. He looked around at faces ranging from supportive to neutral to barely concealed hostility. Debt relief continues. Enforcement remains consistent, but not arbitrary. The Advisory Council provides oversight that prevents the kind of autonomous brutality that characterized previous leadership. And Lady Elara Blackwood serves as co-administrator of territorial policy rather than silent ornament. Several nobles shifted uncomfortably. I know some of you believe these changes have weakened our territory, that compassion invites exploitation, that elevating a woman who started as prisoner proves compromised judgment. Kaedric's voice hardened. But look at the actual results. Tax revenue is up 18%. Population flight has stopped and reversed. Merchant activity has increased. The territory is more stable now than any time in the last decade. He paused, letting the numbers sink in. My father ruled through fear because fear was all he knew. I tried ruling through compassion alone and nearly lost everything. What we have now is synthesis, strategic brutality when necessary, mercy when possible, and constant evaluation of which is required when. Lord Ashton, one of the nobles who'd been exiled and later allowed to return under strict conditions, stood. Your Grace, what guarantee do we have that these policies will continue? That you won't revert to your father's methods when pressure mounts again? None, Kaedric said bluntly. I can't guarantee anything except that I'll continue trying to make the best decisions possible given available information. Sometimes I'll be too harsh, sometimes too lenient. I'm going to fail regularly because leadership is complicated, and I'm human. But I will never stop trying to build something better than what I inherited. The honesty seemed to surprise everyone. What I can guarantee is that rebellion will be met with overwhelming force, that loyalty will be rewarded, that fair treatment is available to anyone willing to engage in good faith. Those are the only promises I can make. He sat down, and the assembly erupted in discussion. Not everyone was satisfied. Some nobles clearly wanted the old system back. Others wanted even more radical reform. But most seemed willing to accept the uncertain middle ground Kaedric was building. That evening, he found Elara in their private quarters reading through financial reports. She looked up when he entered, setting aside the papers. How did it go? About as well as speeches about moral ambiguity ever go. Some people convinced, some resistant. Most just waiting to see what happens next. That's leadership. Constant uncertainty about whether you're doing the right thing. He sat beside her on the couch, Exhaustion finally catching up. Do you ever regret it? This life? The violence and compromise and constant pressure? Every day. She leaned against him. But I also can't imagine wanting any other life. This is real. It matters. We're building something that might actually improve people's existence rather than just extracting value from them. Even if that something requires occasional brutality to protect, especially then. Idealism without pragmatism is just performance. You've learned to balance both. That's rare. Kadric wrapped his arm around her. I couldn't have done any of this without you. Yes, you could have. You just would have been more miserable and made worse decisions. Fair. They sat in comfortable silence while outside the winter continued, and the territory held together through careful balance rather than overwhelming force. It wasn't the empire his father built. It was something smaller, more fragile, more human. It was something Kadric could actually live with. Years passed. The territory stabilized further. The advisory council became less intrusive as trust built gradually. New families rose to prominence while old ones adapted to changed circumstances. The kind of slow evolution that characterized functional governance rather than crisis management. Kedric's wound eventually healed, though it ached in cold weather and served as permanent reminder of how close he'd come to losing everything. He learned to read the ache as useful information rather than just pain. Reminder that vulnerability was constant and survival required attention. He and Elara never had the peaceful life they occasionally fantasized about. Problems arose constantly. Rival territories tested boundaries. The Crown maintained oversight that prevented complete autonomy. Internal factions still formed around competing visions of governance. But they faced everything together, and that made the impossible merely difficult. On the 5th anniversary of the coup attempt, Kadric stood alone in the cemetery where his father was buried. He'd avoided this place since the funeral, but something pulled him back now. Maybe closure. Maybe final confrontation with the ghost that had haunted him for years. The headstone was simple granite with name and dates, nothing about achievements or legacy, just acknowledgement of existence and ending. Kadric stared at it for a long time before finally speaking. You were wrong about almost everything. Wrong about fear being the only reliable motivator. Wrong about love compromising judgment. Wrong about mercy being weakness. He paused. But you were also right that power is fragile and enemies are persistent, and some decisions require brutality regardless of moral preference. The grave didn't answer, but Kadric continued anyway. I'm not the Duke you wanted me to be. I'm softer in some ways, harder in others. I care about people in ways you never did, and that caring has nearly killed me multiple times. But I'm still here, still in charge, still building something that might outlast both of us. He knelt down, brushing snow from the headstone. So I guess what I'm saying is thank you for the lessons that were useful, and I'm sorry I couldn't be the heir you envisioned. But I'm not sorry I chose a different path. Even with all the mistakes and compromises and blood, I'd rather be the flawed Duke I've become than the perfect monster you were. He stood and turned away from the grave, walking back toward the manor where Elara was waiting. Behind him, the old Duke's ghost finally released its hold, and Kadric felt lighter than he had in years. He'd spent so long trying to avoid becoming his father, or completely rejecting his lessons that he'd forgotten the third option, taking what was useful and building something new with it. That night, as he lay in bed beside Elara listening to winter wind test the manor's ancient walls, Kadric thought about legacy, about what he'd leave behind when his own time ended, not the empire his father built through fear, not some utopia where everyone lived in harmony, something messier, something more honest. A territory that functioned through careful balance rather than overwhelming dominance. Systems that were fair more often than not. Leadership that tried to do right, even when right was complicated and context-dependent. It wasn't perfect. It never would be. But it was better than what came before, and that had to be enough. Beside him, Elara stirred in her sleep, and Kadric pulled her closer. This woman who'd started as prisoner and become partner. Who'd challenged him constantly and made him stronger through that challenge, who'd loved him despite and because of his flaws. She was the best decision he'd ever made, and the worst politically, and somehow both of those things were true simultaneously. That was life, complicated and contradictory, and requiring constant navigation without clear map. The Duke and his Duchess. Building something imperfect but real, making mistakes and learning from them. Surviving through adaptation rather than rigid adherence to anyone's philosophy. And maybe that was the real lesson his father never learned. That strength wasn't about never breaking. It was about breaking and choosing to rebuild anyway. About accepting that you'd fail sometimes and trying anyway. About loving people knowing that love made you vulnerable and deciding the vulnerability was worth it. Outside, snow continued falling across the Northern Territory. Inside Blackwood Manor, the Duke slept beside his wife while centuries of brutal family history slowly transformed into something that might actually resemble hope. Not the naive hope of people who'd never seen darkness. The earned hope of people who'd walked through hell and remembered how to care about each other on the other side. It wasn't the ending anyone expected, but it was the ending they'd fought for, and that made it theirs. Years later, when historians wrote about the transformation of the Northern Territories from feared military state to functioning governance, they would point to Duke Cadric Blackwood as the pivot point, the leader who'd learned to balance his father's brutal pragmatism with his own hard-won compassion. They would write about the Southern campaign and the coup attempt and the gradual reforms that followed. They would analyze his policies and debate his methods and argue about whether he'd been too cruel or too kind. But they would miss the most important part. The part where a broken man learned to build something beautiful from the ruins of everything he'd been taught to worship. The part where love proved stronger than fear, not because love won easily, but because two people chose it daily despite every reason not to. The part where mercy and brutality learned to coexist in the same leader, making him both more dangerous and more human than anyone who came before. That was the story that mattered. That was the legacy worth leaving. And standing on the battlements of Blackwood Manor years later, Duke Cadric Blackwood looked out at the territory he'd bled to protect and finally understood what his father never did. Power wasn't about how many people feared you. It was about how many people trusted you enough to follow you into uncertainty. And beside him stood Duchess Elara Blackwood, her hand in his, both of them scarred and complicated and absolutely certain. They'd built something worth protecting, and they would defend it with everything they had, for as long as they could, knowing that someday it would pass to others who would either honor what they'd built or tear it down and start again. That was the nature of legacy. Impermanent, fragile, built on hope rather than certainty, but real enough to matter while it lasted. And in the end, that was all anyone could ask for.